She had 8 minutes before the man on the table died, and the doctor blocking her path had absolutely no idea who she was. The emergency bay at Harwick General smelled like smoke and copper, 43 injured people stacking up in the corridors, and Dr. Marcus Holt was standing in front of her, with his arms crossed, face red, telling a nurse in blue scrubs that she needed to sit down and wait for orders. She didn't sit down. She stepped around him. And in the next 7 minutes, she did things with her hands that nobody in that room had ever seen a nurse do things. Learned in places that don't appear on any map. Nobody knew. Not yet. If this is your first time here, you are exactly where you need to be. This channel tells stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark, stories about the people everyone overlooks, the quiet ones who turn out to be the most dangerous people in the room. Subscribe right now so you never miss what's coming next, because the stories only get more intense from here. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment gets read. Now, stay with me, because this one starts fast and doesn't stop. The fog came in off the bay most mornings in Dunmore, Massachusetts, settling low over the water and rolling up through the streets until the whole city smelled like salt and cold concrete. It was the kind of place where people minded their business, where the fishermen were out before sunrise, and the coffee shops didn't bother with anything fancy, and where Harwick General Medical Center sat on the corner of Aldrich and Route 9, like it had always been there, which it had for 61 years. The building itself was not impressive. It had been expanded 3 times since its original construction, and each addition showed different brick colors, mismatched window sizes, a covered walkway between the original structure and the 1990s annex that leaked in heavy rain. Inside, it ran the way most mid-sized regional hospitals ran, understaffed by 15%, overworked by 20%, sustained by the specific kind of institutional pride that people develop when they've been doing hard work in an imperfect place for a long time. Nora Vasquez had been working at Harwick General for 3 weeks. She arrived each morning at 15 minutes before her shift began, and she spent those 15 minutes doing something none of the other nurses bothered with. She walked the unit. Not quickly, not as exercise. She moved through the emergency department with deliberate attention, the way a pilot walks a tarmac before a flight, looking for things that shouldn't be there and confirming that things that should be there were. She checked the crash cart placement. She noted which beds had new patients overnight, which monitors were running slow, which supply closets had been restocked, and which ones were running low on things that mattered. She said good morning to the overnight staff, asked how the shift had gone, and listened to the answers in a way that made people feel like she was actually collecting information rather than performing courtesy. Because she memorized the layout not just of the rooms, but of the rhythms when the attending physicians rotated, when the lab runners came through, which orderlies moved fast, and which ones needed prompting, where the bottlenecks formed on a busy morning, how long it took for radiology to answer an urgent call at different times of day. She built a mental map of the place that went several layers deeper than what appeared on the staff orientation packet, which she had read once and retained entirely. Nobody asked her to do any of this. She just did it. To the day shift staff, she was pleasant enough, competent enough, and almost aggressively unremarkable. Brown hair pulled back in a low bun, average height on the lean side, with the kind of physical stillness that reads as calm until you notice it's actually something more like readiness. She wore standard issue navy scrubs and kept her badge clipped at her collar. She didn't gossip at the nurse's station or linger after her shift ended to talk about weekend plans. She ate lunch alone when she ate at all, usually at the back table near the window, with whatever she'd brought from home, and she read nothing while she ate. No phone. No book, just sat with her food and looked out at the parking lot with the focused expression of someone thinking through a long list of problems in sequential order. She never seemed anxious. She never seemed particularly relaxed either. She occupied a register that most people couldn't immediately categorize, and things that people can't categorize make them uncomfortable. The other nurses had their theories. She got fired's had theirs somewhere. Said Donna Price, who had worked the ER for 11 years and had developed opinions about every new hire within 48 hours of their arrival. Nobody's that contained, unless something happened. She's just quiet, said Marcus Talley, a travel nurse, 2 months into his contract. Some people are quiet. Quiet is fine. Quiet, I know how to read. Donna glanced down the hall to where Nora was charting, back straight, face neutral. She doesn't read. That's different. Marcus didn't have a response to that, mostly because Donna wasn't entirely wrong. What was true, Nora Vasquez had a resume gap of 6 years, 2014 to 2020. That simply said military service with no elaboration. What was also true, she had passed every credentialing requirement, every background check, and every clinical competency evaluation without issue. What the resume did not say, and what no one at Harwick General had any way of knowing, was what that military service had actually looked like. The first visible friction started on a Tuesday in Nora's 3rd week, when Dr. Marcus Holt walked into Bay 4 and found her adjusting the IV drip rate on a post-surgical patient named Gerald Oakes, 67, recovering from a bowel resection. Holt was 44, board certified in emergency medicine, and he carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had spent 15 years being told he was excellent, and had come to regard his own judgment as a baseline fact rather than an opinion. He was not, by the standards of hospital physicians, a bad doctor. He made good calls, he moved fast under pressure, and he genuinely cared about patient outcomes. He was also the kind of man who had decided early in his career that hierarchy existed for important reasons, that roles needed to be respected, and that when people stepped outside their designated boundaries without permission, the entire system became unreliable. He believed this with the sincerity of someone who had never been tested by a situation that required someone to break the rules to prevent a disaster. He looked at the IV pump, then at Nora. "What are you adjusting?" She didn't look up immediately. She finished the adjustment, confirmed the new rate, checked the patient's hand for signs of infiltration, and then turned to face him. Mr. Oakes was showing early signs of fluid overload. His original post-op rate was set at 120 per hour. I've brought it down to 80 and flagged it for the attending. Holt's eyes moved to the chart on the wall mount. Who authorized the change? Dr. Yohn. I caught her between procedures at 6:52 and walked her through Mr. Oakes' signs. She told me to adjust and document. Dr. Yohn is assigned to the surgical floor. She was in the hallway outside the ER. She's authorized to give verbal orders in an urgent situation. Nora held his eyes, without challenge, but without apology either. Mr. Oakes has documented diastolic dysfunction in his prior records. It wasn't prominently flagged in the intake summary. The fluid rate that's appropriate for most post-surgical patients is not appropriate for him. I reviewed his history this morning when I came on. Gerald Oakes lay in the bed watching both of them with the careful expression of a man who knew better than to speak. Holt looked at Nora for several seconds. Something shifted in his expression, not quite anger, but a recalibration of some kind, a recognition that he had walked in expecting to find something he could correct, and instead found someone who had already done the work, obtained authorization, and was standing in front of him with the data to back up every decision. He had nothing to correct, which somehow made it worse. Next time he said, his voice precisely level, "You wait for my review before adjusting anything on a patient in this bay. The protocol includes provision for urgent modification under attending authorization," Nora said, which I followed. He left without another word. Donna, who had been watching from just outside the bay, appeared at Nora's shoulder the moment Holt's back cleared the corner. "That was Marcus Holt," she said, as if perhaps Nora hadn't been aware. "I know. He's the senior attending on this rotation. He has the ear of the department chair. Okay. He is not someone who forgets when he feels like he's been shown up." Donna paused. "I'm just saying." "I appreciate it," Nora said, and moved on to Bay 6. The friction, once it started, did not ease. Holt was methodical in the way he handled things he perceived as problems, and he had decided, within 48 hours of the Bay 4 incident, that Nora Vasquez was a problem that needed to be managed. He wrote 2 documentation notes in the following week. Both flagged her for what he characterized as operating outside her scope of practice. Both were technically incorrect. In both cases, Nora had followed protocol exactly, with authorization, with documentation, but they went into her personnel file, and personnel files accumulate weight regardless of individual accuracy. An incorrect notation that isn't formally contested becomes part of the record. Holt understood this. He had watched it work before. He questioned her in front of other staff twice in the span of 6 days. The first time, he asked her to explain a medication dosage calculation she had performed correctly in front of 3 other nurses, in a tone that implied he expected to find an error. He didn't find one. The second time, he challenged a triage decision she had made during his absence, a decision that the 2 other attending physicians on shift that day privately agreed was exactly right, and he did it in the middle of the nurses' station, where half the ER staff could hear. He never raised his voice. That was what made it effective. A shouting doctor is visible and documentable. A calm, precise doctor who asks the right questions in the right settings, who consistently implies inadequacy without ever stating it directly, that is something different. That is institutional, and institutional is hard to fight. Nora did not fight it loudly. She didn't go to Linda Cho, the nursing manager, in tears or in fury. She didn't complain to colleagues or build alliances against him. What she did quietly was document. She kept her own record of every interaction, time-stamped, factual, stored in a format that couldn't be accessed or edited by anyone at the hospital. She answered each challenge with data and said nothing beyond what was necessary. She continued to do her job with the same precision she had brought to it on day 1, which was not nothing, but which also could not protect her from what was coming. The other nurses watched. They made calculations. They began, without consciously deciding to create a small distance between themselves and Nora, not out of cruelty, but out of the institutional survival instinct that any long-term hospital employee develops. Proximity to the person a powerful physician is targeting is its own kind of risk. Marcus Talley stopped saving her a seat at pre-shift briefings. Donna became professionally pleasant and personally remote. Priya, the unit secretary, still smiled, but it was a smaller smile than before, the kind that apologizes without saying anything. Nora ate her lunch at the window table and looked at the parking lot and thought about other things. She was used to being the person nobody quite knew what to do with. She had been that person in environments considerably more demanding than a regional emergency in coastal Massachusetts. She knew how to function inside the discomfort without letting it affect her work. What she couldn't entirely prevent was what happened to the work's recognition, the way good decisions quietly disappeared when someone with authority decided not to acknowledge them. The way 3 weeks of solid clinical performance could be reframed as a pattern of overreach by a man who knew how to use institutional language. She had known, coming into civilian medicine, that this was a possibility. She had told herself she could manage it. She wasn't sure anymore that managing it was the right frame. At the end of the 3rd week, Holt filed a formal complaint. He submitted it to Dr. Elise Oduya, the department chair, on a Wednesday afternoon. The complaint was 4 pages. It cited 7 specific incidents by date and time. It used phrases like consistent pattern of overreach, disregard for established chain of command, and conduct creating potential liability and confusion in the emergency setting. It was the document of a man who had been building toward it carefully, and it was written well enough that a reader who didn't know the facts would find it entirely credible. Linda Cho called Nora into her office on Thursday. The office was small and smelled like carpet cleaner, and the hand sanitizer Linda kept on her desk. Linda was a careful woman who had spent 18 years in hospital administration by committing to the principle of never visibly taking a side until the winning side was obvious. She set the psychologically, professionally, like she set the complaint on the desk at a crime scene, and she folded her hands on top of her notepad, and she folded her hands on top of, she looked at Nora with the expression of someone performing neutrality. "This is a formal complaint," she said. "It goes into your personnel record, which means it becomes part of your employment history here and potentially beyond." "I understand." Dr. Holt is characterizing a series of incidents as a pattern. The department chair takes patterns seriously. Linda paused. "He's requesting that you be reassigned to a non-emergency unit pending review, or that your employment be terminated. Is there a specific clinical outcome he's citing as harm?" "He's not citing patient harm. He's citing risk." Linda shifted slightly. "The concerns is systemic. The argument is that your approach, even when results are good, creates an environment where the lines of authority become unclear." Nora looked at the complaint on the desk. She didn't touch it. "Can I have a copy for my own records?" Linda blinked. Of all the responses she had prepared for, this was apparently not one of them. "Yes, I'll have Priya make one. Thank you." Nora stood and smoothed the front of her scrubs. "Is there anything else for right now?" "I'd encourage you to consider your options carefully," Linda said. "A voluntary reassignment might be." "I'll think about it," Nora said, and left. She walked the length of the corridor without stopping. She passed the nurses' station, where Donna and Marcus Talley were charting, and she didn't make eye contact with either of them. She went to the supply closet at the end of the hall, the one with the flickering overhead light that nobody used in the afternoon, and she went inside and closed the door and stood in the dimness. She stood there for 90 seconds. She was 38 years old. She had kept people alive in circumstances that would qualify as nightmares for most of the people in this building. She had made decisions in the dark, in moving vehicles, in collapsed structures with equipment that barely functioned, and she had been right more often than the odds warranted, and she had been wrong sometimes too, and she carried both of those things every single day. She had come home from that work and rebuilt herself into something that could function in the ordinary world, which was harder than anything she wanted to admit. And she had found this job, this specific kind of work, because it was the closest civilian equivalent to the only thing that had ever made her feel like she was using the full capacity of what she was. And now a man who had never been tested by anything real was trying to take it from her because she had made him feel, for one moment in Bay 4, like she knew something he didn't. She breathed in. She breathed out. She came out of the supply closet and finished her shift. The mass casualty event happened on a Friday morning in the first week of November. Route 11 outside Dunmore curved around the southern bay before straightening into the industrial corridor, where the Caldwell Fuel Depot sat behind a chain-link fence and a row of dying evergreens. The depot had been operating for 32 years. It had citations for deferred maintenance going back 4 years, which were known to the relevant regulatory agencies and had been scheduled for follow-up review multiple times. At 8:14 in the morning, a tanker truck hauling industrial solvent jackknifed on the curve past Exit 4, sideswiping 2 vehicles and coming to rest across both lanes. The resulting pileup involved 11 vehicles in the first 90 seconds. The fire started from the tanker's ruptured chassis. It reached a secondary fuel storage tank at 8:19. The explosion that followed was, by industrial standards, relatively contained. By every other standard, it was devastating. The blast radius caught a road construction crew that had been setting up BIM carriers 200 meters east of the depot gate, and it sent debris across 4 lanes of highway into oncoming traffic. The final count, 38 people injured, 6 critical. Harwick General was the closest Level 2 trauma facility, 8 minutes from the site. Nora heard the radio traffic change before the overhead alert sounded. She was in the middle of a morning medication check, moving between bays, the tweens with a clipboard, and she paused with her pen over the chart and listened to the quality of the communications, the number of voices, the controlled urgency in the dispatcher's cadence, the specific language being used. And she understood what was coming with the same certainty she had learned to trust in environments where certainty was the difference between preparation and catastrophe. She set the clipboard on the counter. She turned to the supply room. Hey, it was Priya, appearing in the hallway, voice uncertain. They just put out an MCI alert. EMS is saying, I know. How many bays do we have clear? 3, maybe 4 if we move. Move them. All of them. Anyone who can be safely relocated, get them out of the main trauma bays now. Nora was already pulling supplies, stacking them on a cart with the efficiency of someone who has done this in worse conditions with less available. Get me the trauma team paged. Get respiratory therapy down here. Call the surgical floor and tell them to hold 2 ORs. I don't have authority to Priya. Nora looked at her directly. The authority is coming through the door in about 5 minutes. Do it now, so that when the authority arrives, there's something functional waiting for it. Okay? Priya went. Nora moved through the pre-configuration the way she had moved through dozens of other pre-configurations in other places. Fast, deliberate, anchored by a mental model of how mass casualty triage worked when it worked and how it collapsed when it didn't. The bottlenecks. Always the bottlenecks. She physically relocated 2 equipment carts from the hallway junction near radiology, opening the passage width by 3 feet. She identified the 2 orderlies on shift, a heavyset man named Paul and a younger guy named Terrence, and she gave them each a specific position and a specific instruction and told them not to move from those positions regardless of what anyone else told them unless she countermanded it personally. Paul looked at her for a second. You a doctor? No, she said. Stay here. Holt arrived at 8:22. Coming in from the physician lounge, where he'd been eating a late breakfast. He stopped in the entrance to the ER and looked at what the room had become in the last 7 minutes, cleared bays, the repositioned carts, the orderlies at the doors, the supplies staged at 3 distinct points rather than clustered at the main station ends, and his face went through several expressions in quick succession. Who authorized this configuration? Nora passed him with a trauma kit under her arm. I did. Stop. He moved to intercept her, stepping into her path. His voice was controlled, but his body was telling a different story, was genuinely alarmed, not just irritated. And she could see him trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the framework he used to understand who she was. I need you to explain to me right now what you think you're doing, because I have a formal complaint pending against you. And you are. The ambulance bay doors opened. The first wave, 4 vehicles, 15 patients, paramedics calling out vitals before the gurneys cleared the threshold, and the ER went from tense anticipation to controlled chaos in the time it took Holt to turn his head. Nora went to the first stretcher. The paramedic was young, maybe 26, running on adrenaline, rattling off vitals, with the compressed speed of someone who had practiced this, but was experiencing the real version for the first time at this scale. Adult male, 41, blast proximity, secondary burns, chest and arms, bilateral. Airway first. Nora leaned over the patient. A heavy-set man with singed eyebrows and soot darkening the skin around his nose and mouth. She checked his lips, his nares, put 2 fingers at the base of his throat. She listened to his breathing without a stethoscope for 2 seconds. You hearing Stridor on the ride-in? Started about 3 minutes out. His airway is going to close. She looked up, found Doctor. Patricia Yoon crossing the room toward her. Dr. Yoon, blast patient, probable inhalation. I'm hearing early stridor, soot past the pharynx. The edema isn't fully occlusive yet, but it will be. Yoon reached the stretcher and did her own assessment in 12 seconds. She straightened. How long? I don't know. Could be minutes. Nora was already reaching for the intubation tray she'd staged. He looks okay right now. That's the problem. Get him to Bay 1. Yuan raised her voice to the room. Bay 1, now intubation setup. The patient survived. The intubation happened with 2 minutes to spare by the attending's estimate, which meant it happened with the margin Nora had calculated, and not much more. Over the next 90 minutes, 31 patients came through the doors of Harwick General. Nora moved through all of them, not as the physician managing the floor that was Yun and Holt and the two other attendings who arrived within 20 minutes, but as something harder to categorize and in some ways more essential. She was the connective tissue. She was the person who noticed what the physicians, each locked into their individual patients, couldn't see from where they were standing. She caught a subdural hematoma on a man who had presented as ambulatory and oriented complaint of headache. No visible head wound. She noticed the left pupil tracking 2 millimeters wider than the right when he followed her finger. She stopped him from being triaged to the waiting area, got him in front of Holt personally, which required interrupting Holt mid-assessment, which she did without hesitation, and said, unequal pupils, mechanism consistent with secondary blast wave. He needs a head CT before he goes anywhere. Holt looked at the patient, looked at Nora, and ordered the CT. The imaging showed a small but expanding bleed. The patient went to surgery within the hour. She recognized a tension pneumothorax on a construction worker, 29, who was still talking. He'd just gotten knocked down. Was fine. Really. Just needed to call his wife. She heard something in his breath sounds that required standing close and listening carefully, which she did, and then she put her hand gently on his arm and said, I need you to stay still for me. I know you feel okay. I need you to trust me that you're not. He looked at her. Something in the way she said it made him go still. She got Dr. Yuan, and the decompression happened in Bay 3. 6 minutes later, and the construction worker's blood pressure came back from the edge it had been standing on without his knowing. She made a mistake. A woman in her mid-60s, presenting with smoke inhalation and superficial burns on her forearms. Vitals stable on arrival. Nora assessed her, classified her as serious but not immediately critical, and moved on to 3 other patients who needed her more urgently. 7 minutes later, the monitors on Bay 8 alarmed and the woman went into cardiac arrest, likely a delayed arrhythmia from the carbon monoxide exposure, the kind that looks like stability until it doesn't. The team running the code got her back after 4 minutes. She would have a full recovery. But Nora heard the alarm from 3 bays away, and she knew which patient it was before she could have explained how, and she stopped what she was doing for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds where her hands, which had been completely steady all morning, stopped moving. She absorbed it. She filed it somewhere to examine later, when there was later. She went back to work. By 11 o'clock, Harwick General had transitioned from active response to recovery. The critical patients were in surgery or in the ICU, stabilized enough that the immediate danger had passed. The walking wounded were being processed through the system. The ER staff moved with the specific exhaustion of people who had done something hard and done it well, and were now experiencing the aftermath of the adrenaline draining out. Robert Finch, the hospital administrator. Robert Finch had arrived at 9:30 and was in the lobby being photographed with the fire department liaison by someone from the communications office. Holt found Nora in the medication room at 11:15. She was restocking, returning everything that had been pulled during the response to its correct locations, systematic, quiet, working from memory, because she had memorized where everything lived on her first day. He stood in the doorway. What you did this morning, he said, is not something that can be framed as nursing practice. The configuration, the clinical calls, directing other nurses through procedures. 4 people have a better chance of going home because the room was ready. She didn't stop restocking. She kept her voice even and her hands moving. That's what I was doing. That's not the point. I know it's not your point. She set a box of gauze on its shelf. It's mine. I don't know what you think this display accomplishes, Holt said. His voice was still controlled, but she could hear something underneath it now. Something he was working to keep compressed. The complaint stands. The review is happening regardless of today. You cannot perform your way out of a formal process. I know that too. Then what are you doing? She turned and looked at him. She was tired in a way that went past the morning's work. Tired in a way she'd been carrying for longer than 3 weeks. And she let a fraction of it show in her face, not because she wanted his sympathy, but because she was done performing in vulnerability at him. My job, she said. That's all I've ever been doing. He stood there for a moment. Then, I'm going to find out who you actually are, Vasquez. Whatever you're hiding, whatever you think that resume gap protects. I'm not hiding anything, she said. I just don't talk about things that aren't your business. He left. She turned back to the shelves. She worked through the rest of the restock, methodically, and when she finished, she stood alone in the medication room and let herself be still for a moment. She was 38 years old, and she had done this specific kind of work, keeping people alive in the middle of chaos in places that would make this morning look like a training exercise. She had done it without credit, without recognition, under conditions of active danger, and she had told herself, coming into this civilian life, that anonymity was a trade she was willing to make. She was still willing. She just hadn't anticipated the cost being this specific. Outside the door, the hospital had resumed its ordinary sounds monitors, intercoms, the rolling resistance of gurney wheels on the linoleum floor. She picked up her bag. She turned off the light. She walked out of the medication room, and that was when she heard Priya's voice from the nurse's station at the end of the hall. Nora. Strange, small, uncertain. There's a call. They said it's a government line. Official. Priya held the desk phone with both hands. They asked for you, specifically. Your full name. Not just the name on the directory. The other one. The one on your military discharge papers. She paused. They said they'll call back tomorrow morning, but they wanted confirmation that you were here, at this hospital, working this floor. The corridor was loud with its ordinary sounds. Nora stood at the end of the hallway and looked at Priya for a long moment, and her face gave away nothing, which was something she had spent a very long time learning how to do. Tell them I'll be here, she said. Priya nodded slowly. Who are they? Nora looked at the phone in Priya's hands. She thought about a unit she hadn't spoken of in 4 years. 7 people she hadn't seen since a debriefing in a windowless room that didn't officially exist. A warning she had passed through channels she wasn't supposed to have access to anymore because the alternative was staying silent, which she had never been able to do. Tell them I'll be here, she said again, and walked toward the exit, and the sound of the hospital closed in behind her like water over a stone. She drove home along the Bay Road with the windows down, despite the cold, because she needed the air moving against her face to keep her thinking clearly, and because the alternative was sitting in the sealed quiet of the car with only her own thoughts for company, which was not something she trusted herself with tonight. The call had come from a government line, verified prefix, the kind that routes through federal switchboards rather than commercial carriers. They had used her full legal name, not the shortened version, on the Harwick General staff directory, not Nora Vasquez, the nurse, but the complete name on documents that were supposed to be filed in systems that civilian hospital administrators had no reason to ever access. They knew where she was. They had confirmed it deliberately, which meant they had been looking, which meant something had changed. She drove and did not let herself speculate beyond what the facts supported, which was a discipline She had learned in a different context and applied here with the same rigor. Speculation without data was just anxiety with structure. She knew one thing: tomorrow morning, the phone would ring again, and she would find out what it meant. She ate dinner standing at her kitchen counter: rice, leftover chicken, a handful of spinach she wilted in the pan, and she went to bed at 9:30, and she lay in the dark with her eyes open for approximately 40 minutes before her body, which had been running on stress hormones since 8 in the morning, finally made the decision for her and pulled her under. She slept without dreaming, which was not always the case. She was at the hospital at 6:30 the next morning, 15 minutes earlier than usual. She didn't know exactly when the call would come, and she didn't know through which line, and she didn't know if it would come to the nurse's station or be routed to the main hospital switchboard. So she did what she always did when she was operating, with incomplete information. She controlled what she could control. She showed up. She did her walk. She did her walk. She checked the crash cart and the supply closets and said good morning to the overnight staff, and she charted the two things she'd noticed needed attention: a low oxygen connection in Bay 3, a monitor in Bay 7, whose alarm threshold had been set incorrectly, and she settled into the beginning of her shift with the specific quality of focus that comes from deciding to simply be where you are and let the rest arrive when it arrives. It arrived at 8:47. Priya appeared at her elbow with the expression of someone carrying something heavier than a telephone message. Main switchboard transferred it down. They asked for you by name again. She held out a slip of paper with a number written on it. They said to call this back on a secure line. They said, she paused, choosing the words carefully. They said to tell you it's in reference to Kestrel. Nora took the slip of paper. She looked at it for 1 second. Kestrel was not a word that existed on her nursing license or her Harwick General personnel file or anywhere in the building she was currently standing in. Kestrel was the operational designator for the unit she had spent 6 years attached to, a word used only in environments with security protocols, filed only in records that required classification to access. The fact that someone had used it in a message routed through a civilian hospital switchboard delivered to a unit secretary who had written it on a pink message slip meant one of two things. Either something had gone significantly wrong with operational security, or someone was using it deliberately and openly because they wanted her to know they had clearance and weren't hiding the fact. She looked at Priya. Is there a private line I can use? Not the nurse's station. The consultation room at the end of the hall. Doctor. Duya uses it for patient calls. Nora nodded and walked there without rushing, and she closed the door behind her, and she stood in the small room with its round table and its 2 chairs and its single window looking out over the staff parking lot, and she dialed. The call connected on the second ring. Vasquez. The voice was male, measured, with the particular flatness of someone who delivers information for a living. I'm going to keep this brief. My name is Rourke. I'm calling on behalf of a team you worked with from 2015 to 2019. You know the one. I know the one, she said. 6 members of that team are currently stateside. They've been requesting to make contact with you for approximately 3 months. We've been working through the appropriate channels to locate you. A pause. Your discharge was standard, your transition was clean, and you didn't make it easy to find. That was intentional, I assume. Yes. Understood. The team has a request. It's not an operational request, nothing that requires your participation. But given your contribution in the final quarter of 2019, there's a formal process they want to complete. Another pause. Briefer. They want to come to you, in person. They asked me to ask your permission. Nora stood at the window. In the parking lot below, a man in scrubs was walking toward the building with a coffee in each hand, taking careful small steps over a patch of ice near the curb. When? She said Monday, if that's acceptable. Today was Saturday. It's acceptable. They'll come to the hospital. Team leader said it should happen where you work. His words. She thought about that, about why specifically where she worked. All right, one more thing, Vasquez. His voice shifted slightly, not warmer, but more deliberate. We're aware of the situation with the hospital administration. The formal complaint that's been filed against you. He paused. We became aware of it through secondary channels. I want to be clear that Monday's visit is not contingent on that situation and is not intended to address it. But given the timing, I'd advise you to make sure you're still employed when Monday comes. The line ended. Nora stood with the phone in her hand for a moment, then set it down on the table. She was being investigated for termination by a formal complaint filed 3 days ago. She was being visited on Monday by a team whose existence required classified clearance to acknowledge. And she had 2 days in between, during which Marx Holt was presumably constructing in Stemperthen whatever the next stage of his campaign looked like. She went back to her shift. Saturday passed quietly, which she did not trust. Holt was not on rotation. Yoon was the senior attending, and the day moved at the manageable pace that Saturday mornings sometimes allowed a broken wrist from a fall on the ice near the boardwalk, 2 chest pains that turned out to be nothing serious, a child with croup who scared her parents considerably more than she scared the medical staff. Nora worked her cases, charted cleanly, and said nothing to anyone about the phone call. Sunday was harder. She had the day off, which meant 12 hours in her apartment with the fog outside the windows and the quiet inside them, and she spent the morning running, 5 miles along the Bay Road in the cold, because running was the thing she did when she needed to process without processing, when she needed her body working hard enough that her mind could move at its own pace without her interfering. She ran until her lungs ached and her fingers went numb inside her gloves, and by the time she turned back toward home, she had arrived at something like equilibrium, which was the best she could ask for. She thought about the team, about the 7 people who had been with her in places she couldn't describe in any setting without security protocols, under conditions that had required all of them to operate at the absolute limit of what human beings could do under stress. She had not been close to them in the way that the word close usually means. She had not known their families, their histories, their lives outside the operational context. What she had known was how they functioned under pressure, which is a different, and in some ways more intimate kind of knowledge. She had trusted them with her life on a technical level, which is not the same as trusting them emotionally, but it is not nothing either. She wondered what they looked like now, whether 4 years had changed them in the ways it had changed her. She wondered more specifically what the team leader looked like now. His name was Garrett Delaney, though she had known him only as Delaney during the years they'd worked together. 36, maybe 37 by now. Methodical. Quiet in a way that she had recognized as similar to her own quietness, not as reserve, but the particular stillness of someone who had learned to think before everything else. He had been good at the work, which was the highest compliment available in that context. She had sent the warning through his channel. In October 2019, she had intercepted information during a routine medical assessment, a patient saying something to her in a clinical context that the patient did not understand was significant, because the patient did not know what she was. She had processed what it meant, and she had known that reporting it through official channels would take time she didn't think they had, and she had used a contact method she was not supposed to still have access to, and had sent Delaney a message in 6 words. She had never known if it got through. Apparently it had. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with a light sleet that made the parking lot at Harwick General treacherous and slowed everything down by 20 minutes across the board. Nora arrived at her usual time, did her usual walk, and said nothing to anyone. She had told herself over the weekend that she would not anticipate. She would work her shift, and what happened would happen. She did not entirely succeed at not anticipating. At 9:15, Holt arrived. He was not scheduled until 10, which meant he had come in early which meant he had something specific in mind. He moved through the ER with his jacket still on, which he almost never did, stopping to say something to Donna at the nurse's station that Nora couldn't hear from Bay 2. Donna's expression shifted in the way it did when she was receiving information she wasn't sure what to do with. Holt moved on to Dr. Oduya's office and closed the door behind him. Nora watched this from Bay 2, where she was setting up an IV line for a patient with a kidney stone, and she noted it and turned her attention back to the patient. A man named Stuart Fellows, who was 49 and miserable, and who needed the IV and her attention much more than she needed to watch administrative maneuvering across the hall. "Is it always this cold in here?" Stuart said. "It's a hospital. They run the AC year-round. I feel like a leftover." "You're going to feel a lot better in about 20 minutes, she said. "The hydration helps, and the pain medication is going in now. Try to breathe slowly. Easy for you to say." He winced. "You ever had a kidney stone?" "No. It's like imagine someone put a pebble inside your body, and then the pebble decided to do parkour." Despite everything, she almost smiled. "That's a good description." She got him settled and moved to her next case, and the morning ran forward the way mornings do in emergency departments, urgently, unevenly, in the irregular rhythm of whatever the city decided to throw at the building that day. At 10:12, Linda Cho appeared in the hallway and asked Nora to come to the nursing manager's office. Her voice was careful in the way it got when she was preparing to deliver something she'd rehearsed. The office, the desk, the folded hands. Nora had been here before. This time there were 2 documents on the desk instead of 1. Linda set her hand on the first. "Dr. Holt has submitted an addendum to his original complaint. It includes documentation of," she looked down at the paper conduct during Friday's MCI response, "that he characterizes as willful disregard for physician authority and unilateral clinical decision-making that placed patients at risk." Which patients does he say were placed at risk? He doesn't cite specific adverse outcomes. Because there weren't any. Nora. Linda's voice was not unkind, which was almost worse than if it had been. "He is a board-certified attending physician with 15 years at this institution. The department chair has reviewed both complaints. She has authorized a formal remediation process, which require you to work under direct physician supervision for a period of no less than 30 days, with a performance review at the end of that period." Nora looked at the document. Remediation was the institutional word for the stage before termination. It was how hospitals managed out people they had decided to remove while creating a paper trail that protected the institution from wrongful dismissal claims. She had seen it happen to other nurses. She had never expected to be sitting on this side of the desk. "And if I decline the remediation?" Linda's silence was its own answer. "When does it start?" "Effective immediately. Dr. Holt has agreed to serve as your supervising physician for the duration of the period." Linda paused. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like I'm being supervised by the person who filed the complaint against me." The department chair approved the assignment. Nora sat with that for a moment. Holt, as her supervising physician, meant every clinical decision she made would require his sign-off. It meant he would have documentation access to her work in real time. It meant he could build an evidentiary record against her. At the same time, he was supposed to be objectively evaluating her, and there was nothing in the formal remediation protocol that prevented that. Because the protocol had been designed for genuine performance issues, not for this. "Okay," she said. "I'm sorry," Linda said, and Nora believed her, for whatever that was worth. She was standing at the nurse's station at 10:40, reviewing the remediation paperwork that Priya had printed for her, when she heard the ER entrance doors open at the far end of the hall. She did not look up immediately. The doors opened constantly. That was what doors in emergency departments did. But then Donna made a sound, not a word, just a sound, a small involuntary intake of breath, and Nora looked up. There were 7 of them. They were wearing civilian clothes. Jeans, jackets, plain shirts, the deliberate anonymity of people who know how to dress to move through public spaces without attracting attention. They were different heights, different builds, a spread of ages from early 30s to mid-40s. 2 women, 5 men. Nothing about their clothing marked them as anything other than ordinary people, and yet the way they moved through the entrance turned every head in the hallway within 4 seconds, because there are things that training imprints on a person's body that clothing cannot cover. The way they scanned the room without appearing to. The way they moved in a formation that looked casual, but wasn't. The way they were each, at any given moment, aware of every other person in the space. The ER went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something happens that nobody has a category for yet. The man at the front of the group was 6 feet, medium build, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and a face that had weathered considerably since the last time she had seen it. He moved the way she remembered him, moving with an economy of motion that eliminated everything unnecessary. He looked older. 4 years, and whatever had happened in them had landed on him visibly, which she noted without judgment, because she suspected 4 years and whatever had happened in them had done the same to her. Garrett Delaney stopped in the center of the hallway. He looked at her across 15 feet of linoleum and institutional fluorescent light. And then Nora Vasquez, who had not flinched in 3 weeks of systematic undermining by a man with institutional power, felt something shift in her chest, not pain, but something adjacent to it, the specific feeling of a door opening that you had decided to leave closed. She took 3 steps forward. Delaney closed the remaining distance. "You're hard to find," he said. His voice was the same. Quieter than you expected from someone his size, words arriving in precise clusters. "That was intentional. I know." He studied her face. "You look the same." "You don't," she said, which was honest. Something passed across his expression. "No, I don't." He turned, slightly, toward the 6 people behind him. The whole team wanted to come. I told them it wasn't a request they got to decline. She looked at them, at the 6 faces she had worked, in places that didn't appear on any map, under conditions that had required all of them to be the absolute best version of what they were capable of, every single time, without exception. She recognized each of them. She felt the recognition land in her body in a way that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with the specific kind of bond that forms when people have kept each other alive. None of them spoke. Delaney reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and withdrew a folded document. He held it in both hands, before anything else, before whatever else we need to say. He unfolded it. In October of 2019, we received intelligence through an unsecured channel. 6 words. We acted on it. 7 members of the team were in a building when the information arrived, and because we moved on it immediately, all 7 walked out. He looked at her. "You sent it." "Yes." "How did you still have access to that channel?" "I didn't. I rebuilt it from memory and got lucky with the encryption." He absorbed this. "You could have been prosecuted for that." "I'm aware." "You did it anyway. There wasn't another option that worked in time." Delaney looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, the ER had gone completely still. Nurses, orderlies, the administrative staff, 2 patients in the hallway who had stopped their slow walks to whatever appointments waited for them. Even Holt, who had emerged from his office at some point in the last 2 minutes, stood at the edge of the hallway with his arms at his sides, watching. Delaney folded the document and put it back in his pocket. He straightened his spine. And then, with the practiced precision of someone who had done this in formal settings many times and understood exactly what the gesture signified, he brought his right hand up in a salute. Not a casual salute. The full version, rigid, deliberate, the kind that, in military context, carries the weight of institutional recognition and personal respect in equal measure. Behind him, all at once, 6 people did the same. 7 former operators standing at attention in the hallway of a regional emergency department in Dunmore, Massachusetts, saluting a woman in navy scrubs who was standing next to a stack of remediation paperwork that had been handed to her 40 minutes ago. The silence in the room was absolute. Nora Vasquez stood straight. She brought her right hand up and returned the salute, and she held it, and her face was composed and still the way it always was, and only someone standing very close could have seen what was happening in her eyes. She held the salute for 3 full seconds. Then she brought her hand down. "At ease," she said quietly, which was not exactly the right phrasing for the context, but which made Delaney's mouth briefly do something that was almost a smile. The room began to breathe again, slowly, in the gradual way that people exhale after witnessing something they don't have words for. Donna was gripping the edge of the nurse's station counter with both hands. Priya had both palms pressed flat on her desk. Marcus Talley, who had appeared from somewhere in the back corridor, stood with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth and his arm frozen in transit. Holt stood at the far end of the hallway. His arms were still at his sides. His face had the blank, stripped quality of a man who has just watched the entire architecture of a situation he believed he controlled, reveal itself to be something different than what he understood. He was looking at the 7 people in civilian clothes who had just saluted the nurse he had been attempting to terminate, and he was doing the math, and the math was not working out the way he had arranged it. Delaney turned his head and looked at Holt. It was a brief look, the practiced assessment of someone who reads environments the way other people read text, fast and without effort. He turned back to Nora. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" he said. "There are things we need to tell you. About what happened after your message. About what it meant." He paused. "And there are a few things we'd like to say in front of the people you work with, if that's acceptable to you." Nora looked at him. She understood what he was offering. She understood that he knew the situation she was in Rourke, had told her as much on the phone, and that this was not coincidental, that the deliberateness of coming here to the hospital, in the building where she worked, in front of the staff and the physician who had filed the complaint, was intentional in the same way that military action is always intentional. It was a deployment, and it had an objective. She thought about whether to accept it. She had spent 3 weeks absorbing Holt's campaign in silence, protecting herself the way she'd always protected herself, through documentation, through precision, through refusing to give him anything he could use against her. She had not asked for help. She had not wanted help, specifically because needing it felt like a concession she was not willing to make to the circumstances. But these were not strangers offering charity. These were people who owed her a debt that had nothing to do with the nurses' station politics of Harwick General, and they had come here across 4 years and considerable institutional complexity to pay it. Declining that was not strength. It was just a different kind of pride, and she had learned, in contexts far more demanding than this, that pride maintained at the expense of the mission was the kind of pride you could not afford. "There's a family consultation room," she said. "Down the hall. Lead the way." She turned and walked. The 7 of them fell in behind her, and the hallway that she walked through every single day, that she had walked through for 3 weeks while being systematically undermined and diminished, felt different with them behind her, not safer, exactly, but changed. Altered in some way she didn't have an immediate word for. At the far end of the hallway, Holt had not moved. She did not look at him as she passed. Inside the consultation room, Delaney set his jacket over the back of a chair, and the team settled into the space with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to working in rooms they've never been in before. 2 of them positioned themselves near the door, without being asked, not blocking it, just present, which was a habit so deep it had stopped being conscious. Delaney leaned forward on the table, hands flat on the surface. "Here's what we need you to know. October 2019. Your message reached us with 11 minutes to spare. We cleared the building. What we didn't know until later was that the intelligence you'd intercepted was connected to a broader operation we'd been tracking for 8 months, one that would have caused significantly more damage If it had succeeded, he paused. Your 6 words gave us the thread we needed to pull. It unraveled something large. Nora sat across from him. How large? Large enough that there's a formal commendation in a classified file with your name on it, said one of the women, Ferris, she remembered, a logistics specialist who spoke in precise bursts and never wasted breath. Large enough that the team has been requesting authorization to acknowledge you formally for 3 months. The authorization came through last week, Delaney said, which is why we're here now and not 3 months ago. Nora was quiet for a moment. I didn't know any of that. You weren't supposed to. You were a civilian when it happened. Technically, you'd been a civilian for 4 months. He looked at her steadily. You acted anyway. Someone had to. That's what you always said. He almost smiled again. We're here to say thank you. In person. In front of witnesses. He glanced at the door, and through the small, rectangular window in it, Nora could see movement in the hallway staff, drifting toward the consultation room, the way people drift toward things they can feel the weight of, even if they can't see them clearly. We heard about the situation you're in here. We didn't come to fix it. That's yours. But we came to say what's true, and truth has a way of addressing certain things on its own. Nora looked at the door. Through the window, she could see Donna's face. Priya, Marcus Talley, and at the back of the gathering, slightly separate from the others, Linda Cho, standing with her arms folded and her expression doing something complicated that Nora had never seen on her face before. She turned back to Delaney. What exactly were you planning to say? The truth, he said simply. Who you are, what you did, what it cost, and what it meant. He paused. With your permission. She thought about Holt's complaint sitting in her file. She thought about the remediation paperwork Priya had printed. She thought about 30 days of being supervised by the man who had built a case against her from nothing, who had looked at her work during the worst mass casualty event Harwick General had seen in a decade and decided that his authority mattered more than the outcome. She thought about the woman in Bay 8 whose heart had stopped and then started again, and about the man whose airway had closed in real time and hadn't been allowed to finish closing, and about the construction worker who had insisted he was fine and whose blood pressure had been quietly killing him, and about every decision she had made that Friday morning that Holt had decided to frame as insubordination. All right, she said. Delaney straightened, and behind him, through the window in the door, she could see that the hallway had filled with people staff from the ER, nurses from the floors above, who had somehow heard, and standing at the very edge of the group, with his arms no longer at his sides, but folded tight across his chest, and his face wearing an expression she had not seen on him before. Marcus Holt, watching. Delaney opened the consultation room door and stepped into the hallway, and the people gathered there went quiet. He looked at the assembled staff for a moment, taking stock the way she remembered him, taking stock of every situation, quickly, completely, without visible effort. My name is Garrett Delaney, he said. His voice carried without effort, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard clearly in difficult conditions. The people behind me are my team. We've worked together for the better part of a decade in operational environments that I can't describe in detail in this setting, and most of us have scars from that work. He paused. The woman you know as Nora Vasquez worked alongside us for 6 years. In that time, she kept more than one member of this team alive, under conditions that I would not wish on anyone in this building. He looked across the gathered faces. She is one of the most capable medical professionals I have ever had the privilege of working beside, in any setting, under any conditions. Another pause. Approximately 4 months after her honorable discharge, she identified intelligence that was critical to the survival of this team and to the disruption of an operation that would have caused serious harm. She acted on that intelligence at considerable personal and legal risk, through channels she was no longer supposed to have access to, because she understood that the mission mattered more than the rules around it. He stopped. She never told us she did it. She didn't ask for acknowledgement. She went home and got a nursing license and went back to work. The hallway was completely silent. Delaney looked at Holt. 7 people are alive right now, he said, because this woman made a decision that she didn't have to make and that cost her something to make. He held Holt's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. I thought you should know who she is. Marcus Holt stood in the hallway of his hospital, surrounded by staff who were looking at him with the kind of eyes that recalibrate everything they've seen over the preceding weeks, and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Nora stood in the doorway of the consultation room and watched him, and she felt the particular absence of triumph that comes when you've been right all along about something that cost you while you were being right. About it, not satisfaction, exactly, but the end of a particular pressure, the way a headache stops, and you notice the silence where it used to be. The silence in the hallway pressed on. And then Priya at the nurse's station began to clap. It was hesitant at first, the single clap of someone acting on impulse before they've decided whether the impulse is wise. And then Donna joined her, and then Marcus Talley, and then it spread down the hallway in the uncoordinated, genuine way that things spread when people are responding to something real rather than performing a response to something scripted. Nora did not move. She stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides and let it happen around her. And her face was still and composed and gave nothing away to anyone who wasn't standing close enough to see her jaw working slightly, as she held something in that she had been holding in for considerably longer than 3 weeks. Delaney stepped back to her side. He leaned slightly closer and said quietly, below the sound of the hallway, "You should know. The formal commendation in your classified file, it's not the only thing that's been filed." She looked at him. 3 months ago, he said, when we started the process to find in you, we learned about certain complaints that had been submitted regarding your conduct at this facility. His voice was neutral, informational, giving nothing away. We contacted the relevant regulatory bodies, not the hospital, the state nursing board, and the credentialing organizations that have jurisdiction over the physicians in this facility. He paused. We submitted a formal record of your service and your demonstrated clinical capabilities, with the appropriate classification clearances attached as context. He paused again. I'm told the relevant parties found it informative. Nora stared at him. When did you do that? Last Tuesday. Last Tuesday. 2 days before Holt submitted his addendum. 2 days before the remediation had been handed to her. Garrett, she said. Yes. You should have told me. You would have told me not to. She couldn't argue with that. There's one more thing, he said, and his voice shifted, still quiet, still controlled, but with something in it that had not been there a moment before. We found out this morning. He turned to look at her directly. The regulatory inquiry into this facility began 3 days ago. It's not focused on you. She waited. It's focused on a pattern of complaint filings that appear to target clinical staff based on personal conflict rather than patient safety. He watched her. The inquiry is examining multiple complaints filed by the same physician over a period of years. Yours is the most recent. The hallway around them was still full of people. The applause had faded into the particular charged quiet that follows it. At the far end of the hall, Holt had not moved. He was looking at Delaney with the expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the thing he thought was watching a ceremony, a visit, a moment of recognition that would resolve and recede and allow the institution to return to its established order, is not, in fact, resolving. Holt pulled out his phone. He looked at it. Whatever was on the screen made something in his posture change, a subtle shift, a fraction of a degree, the way a structure shifts when something in its foundation gives. He looked up. He found Nora's eyes across the length of the hallway, and for the first time in 3 weeks of carefully managed institutional conflict, Marcus Holt looked at Nora Vasquez without the certainty that had been his operating condition since the moment he'd walked into Bay 4 and found her adjusting a drip rate without his permission. He looked at her the way a man looks at something when he's just understood that what he thought was the ground was not the ground. His phone buzzed again in his hand. His phone buzzed a third time, and this time Holt looked at it the way a man looks at something that is changing shape while he watches with the specific attention of someone who has just realized that the situation they believed they were managing has been managing them. He turned and walked to his office. He didn't run. He was too controlled for that. But the quality of his walking was different from every other time she had watched him move through that hallway, and Nora noticed the difference, the way she noticed everything, without expression, without comment, filing it in the part of her mind that tracked operational developments and waited for them to become relevant. The hallway around her was still charged with the residue of the last 10 minutes. Staff were drifting back toward their stations, with the particular self-consciousness of peoples who have witnessed something significant and are not yet sure what to do with it. Donna was back behind the nurse's station counter, pretending to look at a chart, but her eyes kept moving to Nora with an expression that was trying to recalibrate 11 years of professional instinct in real time. Marcus Talley had disappeared back into the corridor. Priya sat at her desk and looked at her hands. Delaney and his team waited. Nora turned to him. The regulatory inquiry. What body exactly? State Medical Board and the Joint Commission. The complaint originated through a federal channel. The record we submitted triggered a mandatory review of the credentialing environment. He kept his voice low, matter of fact. When you attach classified documentation about a nurse's clinical service record to a query about complaints filed against her, certain offices take that seriously. How long does the review take? That's not something I have visibility into. Weeks, probably. Maybe longer. She absorbed this. A regulatory inquiry was not a rescue. It was a process, and processes moved on their own timelines and produced their own results, which were not always the results that logic suggested they should produce. She had worked inside enough institutional structures to know that the existence of an inquiry meant nothing yet about its conclusion. In the meantime, she said, I'm still under remediation. Holt is still my supervising physician. Yes, and if he uses the next however many weeks to build a termination case before the inquiry reaches any conclusion, then you'll need documentation, Delaney said, which you've been keeping. She had been keeping it. Every incident, every notation in her file, every conversation with Linda Cho, time-stamped and stored. Whether that documentation would be sufficient against a 15-year attending with the ear of the department chair was a different question, and one she didn't have an answer to. One of the other team members, a man named Osi, compact and quiet, who had been the team's intelligence specialist, and who Nora remembered as the person least likely to speak, unless what he was about to say was necessary, stepped forward slightly. There's something else, he said. Delaney looked at him. We found something during the search process, Osei said. He was looking at Nora with the focused expression she remembered from briefings, the one that meant he was delivering information he would prefer not to have. When we were pulling background on the facility to understand your situation, we weren't looking for it specifically. He paused. Holt has filed similar complaint sequences against 3 other nurses at 2 previous hospitals. In both cases, the nurses resigned before any formal review concluded. In one case, there was a wrongful dismissal suit filed afterward that settled out of court. The terms were sealed. The hallway outside the consultation room was quieter now. Through the doors window, Nora could see that most of the staff had returned to their positions, though the quality of the ER's ambient noise had changed. Conversations happening at lower register, people aware that something was still unfolding, even if the visible portion of it had passed. He's done this before, she said. 3 times that we could document. Possibly more. She looked at the door, looked at the hallway, looked at the empty space where Holt had been standing 5 minutes ago. Does Linda know? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Unknown, Osi said. The prior incidents were at different institutions. The information exists in professional reference networks, but it's the kind of information that institutions don't always surface during physician credentialing unless someone is specifically looking for it. Nora thought about Linda Cho sitting behind her desk with folded hands and a face performing neutrality. She thought about Dr. Oduya, the department chair, who had reviewed Holt's complaint and authorized the remediation. Whether they knew or didn't know, the result was the same. Nora was under supervision by a man who had done this before, who was good at it, and who had likely counted on the same outcome that had worked for him twice previously, that she would leave before anything formal reached a conclusion. "I'm not leaving," she said, to no one in particular. Delaney looked at her. Good. The team stayed for another 40 minutes. They didn't linger. In the hallway, they moved to the consultation room, gave the ER space to function, and talked to Nora in the direct, unadorned way that she had always found easier than the social most civilian environments required. They told her what they could about the period after October 2019. They told her about operations she hadn't known about, outcomes that her 6 words had made possible, things that existed in classified records she would never have direct access to. They told her what the team had looked like in the months after she left the adjustment, the restructuring, the losses they'd sustained in the 2 years following. She listened. She asked the questions that needed asking and left the others alone. When Ferris described the op that had gone wrong in 2021, where they'd lost 2 people she had known Petrov, and a woman named Alvis, Nora sat with that information quietly, without filling the silence that followed it, which was the right response, and which Ferris acknowledged with a slight nod. "We didn't know if you knew," Ferris said. "I didn't." "I'm sorry we're the ones telling you. It's better than not knowing." She meant that. She had over the years developed a strong preference for accurate information over comfortable absence of information, even when the accurate information was painful, possibly especially then. Comfortable absences had a way of filling with whatever you most feared, which was usually worse than the truth. At 11:15, Delaney stood. The team moved to their feet with the synchronization that came from years of working in the same spaces. "We're not going to be able to stay," he said. "We have a debrief this afternoon in Boston. But I want to say one more thing before we go." He looked at her steadily. "What you're doing here, this work, this building, these people, it matters. I know it doesn't feel like the other thing. I know it probably feels smaller." He paused. "It isn't. I've watched you work this morning for about 20 minutes in the hallway and in the doorway of that bay, and you are doing exactly what you always did, which is keeping people alive in a system that makes that harder than it should be." Another pause. "Don't let one man's ego convince you it's not worth it." Nora looked at him. "When did you get philosophical?" "I've had a lot of driving time." He almost smiled. "Take care of yourself, Vasquez. That's not a suggestion." She walked them to the main entrance. At the door, each of the team members shook her hand firm, brief, the handshake of people for whom physical contact is functional rather than ceremonial. When Delaney shook her hand, he held it for an extra second and looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention she remembered. "The inquiry will take time," he said quietly. "Don't give him anything to use in the meantime." I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." She watched them cross the parking lot. They moved through the sleet in the same formation they'd arrived in, unhurried, organized without appearing to be. She watched until they reached the 2 vehicles at the far end of the lot, and then she turned and went back inside. The shift continued. That was the specific cruelty of institutional conflict. It didn't pause for anything. There were still patients, still assessments, still charting and medication and the ordinary checks, the ordinary demands of a working emergency department. Nora returned to her cases with the same attention she always gave them, which required a certain deliberate act of will because the back of her mind was occupied with the thing Ose had said about Holt's pattern She was running through the implication, and she was running through the implications the way she used to run through tactical scenarios, from multiple angles, testing each one for the places where it broke down. Holt did not emerge from his office until noon. When he did, he was a different version of himself, same controlled posture, same precise movements, but with something compressed behind his eyes that she recognized as the quality of a man managing information he was still processing. He moved through the ER with less eye contact than usual, spoke to the staff in shorter sentences. He came to her station at 12:20. "You have 3 cases to present," he said. The remediation protocol required her to present each case to her supervising physician before closing it. Bay 1, Bay 4, and Bay 7. When would you like to review? Now. Flat, no prefix, no context. She walked him through Bay 1, a 53-year-old woman with a hypertensive crisis, blood pressure 210 over 118 on arrival, currently responding to oral medication and observation. She presented the vitals, the medication choice, the monitoring parameters she'd set. Holt listened, asked 2 questions about the medication selection, received the answers, and moved on without comment. Bay 4, a 22-year-old with a dislocated shoulder from a pickup basketball game, relocated successfully, currently in a sling with discharge instructions being prepared. Holt reviewed the chart, looked at the post-reduction X-ray, said nothing. Bay 7 was where it went sideways. 7 was a 60-year-old man named Harold Innes, retired electrician, presenting with chest pain that had begun 40 minutes before his arrival. Norris had assessed him at 10:30, reviewed his history: hypertension, borderline type 2 diabetes. Former smoker, ordered an EKG and a troponin panel, and started him on aspirin and monitoring while she waited for the results. The EKG had come back 20 minutes ago. Nora had reviewed it and had a call in to cardiology. Holt looked at the EKG printout. He looked at it for several seconds. This is a normal sinus rhythm with nonspecific ST changes. This is not a STEMI. I agree it's not a STEMI, Nora said. The ST changes in V4 and V5 are subtle, but his troponin came back elevated at 0.06, and his pain presentation is atypical. He's describing it as pressure across the jaw and left shoulder rather than classic chest pain. Combined with his risk profile, I think this needs cardiology eyes before we make a disposition decision. You called cardiology before presenting to me. The call has been pending for 15 minutes. They haven't picked up yet. Holt set the EKG down. He looked at Harold Innes, who lay in the bed with the anxious, slightly embarrassed expression of a man who was hoping that all of this medical attention was going to turn out to have been unnecessary. "Mr. Innes," he said, "how is your pain right now?" "Maybe a 4 out of 10, Harold said. "It was a 6 when I came in." "The aspirin helped, I think." Holt looked at Nora. "He's improving. The troponin is borderline. The EKG is nonspecific. We can monitor for a second troponin at the 3-hour mark and reassess. I'd prefer not to wait on the cardiology consult." "You'd prefer." His voice was even, but the words had edges on them. "That's not how this works right now, Vasquez. You present, I decide. That's the remediation protocol." Nora looked at Harold Innes. She thought about what she was seeing in his presentation, the jaw component, the shoulder. The shoulder referral, the slight sheen of perspiration that had developed in the last 20 minutes that he hadn't mentioned because he hadn't noticed it himself. She thought about what a 3-hour wait looked like if she was right about what this was. "I'm noting my clinical concern in the chart," she said. "You're welcome to note whatever you like." She noted it. Detailed, time-stamped, specific the jaw referral, the shoulder component, the perspiration onset at approximately 12:15, her assessment that the combination of findings warranted urgent cardiology review rather than watchful waiting. She documented her recommendation and Holt's decision and the time of both. Then she moved her next case, and she kept moving, because the cases didn't stop. The cardiology fellow called back at 12:50. Nora was in Bay 2 with a pediatric laceration, a 7-year-old who had met a coffee table at considerable speed when she heard the overhead page for the cardiology return call on Bay 7. She closed the suture kit, told the child's mother she'd be back in 2 minutes, and walked to Bay 7 in time to hear Holt on the phone with the fellow. Borderline troponin, nonspecific EKG changes, patient improving on aspirin, Holt was saying. I've got him on monitoring for a repeat troponin at 3 hours. She heard the fellow's voice through the phone, tinny and slightly fast. She couldn't make out the words. Holt's expression shifted. I'm aware of the atypical presentation. The patient is stable. Another pause. I'd prefer to avoid an unnecessary admission if he stopped listening. His jaw moved slightly. All right, I'll have him transferred upstairs. He hung up. He did not look at Nora. He turned to the charge nurse, who happened to be Donna, who had been watching the exchange from the station. Transfer Innes to the cardiac floor. Cardiology wants monitoring and a repeat workup. Donna wrote it down without expression. Nora went back to Bay 2. She finished the suture's 9 stitches, neat and close. The kind of work she did well without thinking about it. The 7-year-old, whose name was apparently Benji, had stopped crying and was now interrogating his mother about whether he would have a cool scar. Probably a small one, Nora told him, right at the eyebrow. That's awesome, Benji said. She discharged them at 1:15 and went to chart Harold Innes's transfer. At 2:40 that afternoon, the cardiac floor called down. Harold Innes had been taken to the cath lab. The cardiology team had identified a significant partial occlusion in the left anterior descending artery, a widowmaker variant, not fully blocked, but serious enough that without intervention, he would have been presenting with a full STEMI within 12 to 24 hours. Donna took the call. She wrote the information down on a notepad. She looked at what she'd written, and then she looked across the station at Nora, and her expression did the thing that Nora had been watching it do all day. Shifting, like a recalibrating, settling into something new. Bay 7 transferred to cath lab, Donna said. I heard. He's going to be okay. They caught it early. Good. Donna looked at her notepad. You called it. Nora didn't answer that. She finished her charting and moved on to the next case, and she kept moving because the cases didn't stop, and the afternoon didn't stop, and the work was what she had and what she was good at. And she was not going to let the fact that she had been right and Holt had been wrong become the thing she was focused on. Because being right about a clinical call while standing inside a formal remediation process was not the same as being protected by it. She knew that. She kept moving. Holt found her at 4 o'clock in the medication room. She had seen this coming, had felt it building since 2:40, since the Catholic lab call. And she was ready for it in the way she was ready for most things that she could feel approaching. She had her back to the door when he entered, and she finished what she was doing before she turned. His face was controlled. It was always controlled. But there were lines in it that she hadn't noticed before, or hadn't noticed in the same configuration. And his eyes had the quality of a man who has been alone with something uncomfortable for several hours and has arrived at a version of himself that is less certain than the one that had walked in this morning. The Innes call, he said. Yes, you were right about the presentation. She waited. The cardiology fellow backed your clinical read. He paused. I should have escalated sooner. This was, she understood, as close as Marcus Holt was going to come to saying what it would actually cost him to say. She had met men like this before, not villains. Exactly. Not people who were consciously malicious, but people whose sense of self was so thoroughly built on the architecture of their own authority that any crack in it felt like a structural threat. They weren't wrong about everything. Holt was a good physician. She had watched him work. He made solid decisions in most contexts. He was also a man who had spent 15 years in an environment that rewarded his certainty and punished other people's expertise when it contradicted him, and that environment had produced something in him that he probably couldn't fully see. The patient is going to be okay, she said. Yes. He looked at her. The documentation you entered this morning. The clinical concern note. It's in the chart, I know. He was quiet for a moment. It's accurate. I know it is. His jaw worked slightly. I'm aware that the regulatory inquiry creates a certain context for everything that's happened in the last several weeks. He wasn't apologizing. She didn't think he was capable of it yet, but he was circling something, and she let him circle it. I'd like to understand something from your perspective. He paused. The MCI response. Friday. You set up that room before I arrived. You made decisions I hadn't authorized. Did you know what you were doing would create a problem? Yes, and you did it anyway. People were coming through those doors in 4 minutes, she said. The room wasn't ready. The choice was to wait for authorization and lose the preparation window, or set up the room and manage the paperwork afterward. She looked at him directly. I chose the outcome over the process. I'll make that choice every time. He absorbed this. That's not a defensible position in a clinical hierarchy. It's a defensible position in front of a patient who's alive. He stood there for a long moment, looking at her with the expression of a man who is working through something he doesn't yet have words for. And she let him look, and she didn't fill the silence. Because she had learned a long time ago that the most important conversation happened in the spaces between what people said. Then he left. She stood alone in the medication room for 30 seconds, and she thought about the regulatory inquiry and about the documentation in her file and about the 3 nurses at 2 previous hospitals who had resigned before anything formal concluded. She thought of OC's face when he delivered that information, and about the way Holt had looked at his phone in the hallway, and about Harold Innes in the cath lab right now, alive and repairable because someone had pushed against a decision that hadn't been right. She thought about what Delaney had said. Don't give him anything to use. She thought about 30 days of remediation. About what 30 days looked like, day by day, in the hands of a man who was very good at institutional processes and who now had a reason, Innes, the EKG, the cardiology call, to understand that his position was less secure than it had been this morning. The thing about a man who was good at institutional processes was that when those processes started to turn against him, he was also good at adjusting what he was doing to protect himself. She was still inside his supervision. She was still inside his documentation reach. And a man who had done this 3 times before knew how to produce a paper record that looked like performance management, even when it wasn't. She went back to her shift. At 5:20, Linda Cho appeared at the nurse's station and asked to speak with Nora in her office. Her voice had a different quality than it had carried in previous conversations, less carefully managed, more direct, with something underneath it that Nora read as urgency. The office, the desk. But this time Linda did not fold her hands. She sat with her elbows on the desk and looked at Nora the way she hadn't looked at her before. I got a call this afternoon, Linda said, from the Joint Commission field officer assigned to the inquiry. She paused. They asked me for documentation of all complaint filings against nursing staff over the last 5 years. All of them. From all physicians. Another pause. They specifically asked about complaint patterns. Okay, Nora. Linda looked at her with the unguarded expression of someone who has stepped outside their professional performance and is speaking plainly. I didn't know about the prior hospitals. I should have. The credentialing process should have surfaced it, and it didn't, and she stopped. That's a problem that belongs to this institution, and I own my part of it. Nora looked at her. She wasn't sure what to do with this version of Linda Cho. She had prepared for the institutional Linda, the careful managed neutrality Linda. This was something else. What happens now? Nora said. The inquiry continues. The department chair has been notified that doctor. Holt's complaint history is part of the scope. Linda's voice was steady but strained, the voice of someone saying difficult things correctly. The remediation assignment has been the department chair is reviewing whether the supervisory assignment is appropriate given the inquiry's scope. Reviewing when? I expect a determination by end of week. End of week was Friday. Today was Monday. 4 days, which was 4 days, during which Holt remained her supervising physician, with full access to her clinical documentation, in a facility where a regulatory inquiry had just expanded its scope to include his complaint pattern, which meant he was now a man with a reason to be afraid and 4 days to do something about it. Linda, Nora said, I need you to hear something. Go ahead. Harold Innes, Bay 7. The chart shows my clinical concern note at 12:20 and doctor. Holt's decision to delay cardiology consult. Make sure that chart is preserved in its current state. She held Linda's eyes. Don't let it be amended. Linda looked at her for a long moment. Charts can't be amended without a documented addendum trail. I know the official answer. I'm asking you to make sure this one specifically is watched. Linda held her gaze, then she nodded once, without elaboration, and that was enough. Nora stood to leave. She had her hand on the door when Linda spoke again. The team that came today, Linda said. The military people. She paused. I looked up the unit designator. The one the man used, Kestrel. It's classified. I can't find anything about it. She paused again. But the Federal Credentialing Office apparently can. Because they called me back 15 minutes after I sent them your personnel file, and they asked me to confirm that you were currently employed here and in good standing. Her voice was careful. I told them yes. Nora opened the door. Nora, she turned. I'm sorry, Linda said, for the parts of this that I could have handled differently. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment. You're handling it now, she said, and walked out. The rest of the shift was ordinary in the specific way that shifts are ordinary. When everything else is not the work continued, patients arrived and were assessed and treated and discharged or admitted. The monitors beeped, the overhead paged. The ER cycled through its rhythms with the institutional indifference to personal drama that was one of its few reliable characteristics. Nora worked. She moved through her cases with attention and precision. She documented everything with the meticulous care of someone who understood that in the current environment, her chart notes were also her testimony. She was correct about everything she needed to be correct about, and in one case, she asked Dr. Yoon for a second opinion on a pediatric fever presentation rather than going it alone, because she was also not going to give anyone grounds to say she acted unilaterally when alternatives existed. Holt worked his side of the floor. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of the things she needed to track, but he did not come back to her cases after the medication room conversation. He's supervised by chart review only, through the EMR system, which she could see because the system flagged supervisory access, and which meant she could document that he was reviewing her cases, which meant there was a record of both her work and his review of it. She was building a record the way she used to build defensive positions layer by layer, with attention to the points where it could be breached. At 7:15, as she was preparing to hand off to the night shift, Priya appeared at her elbow with an expression that had crossed back over into uncertain. There's something you should see, Priya said. On the board. She meant the display board on the wall near the main nursing station. The one that tracked department-wide announcements, internal communications, shift changes. Most of the staff ignored it unless there was something mandatory. Nora walked to it. The communication had been posted at 7:02. It was from the office of Dr. Elise Oduya, department chair. It was addressed to all emergency department staff. It was brief. It read, effective tomorrow, the remediation supervisory assignment currently in place for RN Vasquez is suspended pending review of related administrative processes. Dr. Holt will not serve in a supervisory capacity over RN Vasquez during this period. Further communication to follow. She read it twice. She turned away from the board and looked at the ER at Priya, who was watching her, at Donna, who was pretending to chart and failing at the pretending, at Marcus Talley, who had stopped in the hallway with a patient chart in his hand and was looking at the board with his mouth slightly open. She turned to complete her handoff. And that was when the ambulance radio at the main station crackled with the kind of traffic that cut through everything else, the specific cadence of a mass casualty pre-alert, multiple units, all responding, requesting destination confirmation. Donna grabbed the radio, listened. Her face changed. "What is it?" Nora asked. "Structure fire," Donna said. "Old waterfront building on Pierce Street. It's collapsed." She listened to the radio. "They're saying 30 to 40 people inside. It was an event space." She looked up. First units are 12 minutes out. The ER, which had been winding down toward the 7:30 shift change, went abruptly still. Nora looked at the trauma bays, looked at the staff on hand, counted what she had available: beds, equipment, personnel, the specific resource map of the department at 7:15 on a Monday evening, which was different from 8 in the morning on a Friday and had its own set of constraints. She looked at the door to Holt's office. It was open. He was inside, jacket on, apparently preparing to leave. She looked at the board with Oduya's communication on it, still up, still fresh. She looked at the radio in Donna's hand. The suspension of the remediation assignment was effective tomorrow, which meant that tonight, for the next hour and 15 minutes until the shift formally changed, Marcus Holt was still technically her supervising physician. She looked at the clock. She looked at the radio. She looked at the door to Holt's office. And then Holt walked out of his office and looked at Donna, and Donna looked at him, and the radio crackled again, 30 to 40 people. First units, 11 minutes. Requesting destination, and something moved across Holt's face that was harder to categorize than anything she had seen on it before. He looked at Nora. She looked at him. "Start the prep," he said. She was already moving before the sentence finished. She pulled the first cart with the controlled speed of someone who knew exactly what needed to happen in the next 10 minutes to give 30 to 40 people the best chance of surviving whatever the next hour would bring. She called Paul and Terrence to the doors. She identified the bottleneck points and cleared them. She paged respiratory therapy and the trauma team and the surgical floor. She was 3 minutes into the prep when she heard the second radio call come in, and this one made her stop. Not because of the patient count, which had risen to 45. Not because of the mechanism structure collapse, smoke inhalation, traumatic injuries from falling debris. Because of the address. Pierce Street, the waterfront, the old event space. She knew that. More specifically, she knew who had been scheduled to use it tonight because she had overheard the conversation 2 days ago in the hospital cafeteria. 2 people from the administrative offices talking about the Hospital Foundation's annual donor reception. The one they held every November. The one that the department chair attended. The one that Linda Cho had mentioned in passing last week when she was explaining her Friday afternoon schedule. She stood with the supply cart under her hands and the radio crackling and the 10-minute clock running. And she thought about who might be inside that building. The radio crackled again, and the paramedic's voice came through with a particular compression of someone transmitting from a scene that is still actively unstable. Harwick General, be advised we have confirmed reports of hospital administrative personnel among the victims. Repeat hospital admin staff at the scene. Donna looked at Nora. Nora looked at the door. She moved, not because anyone told her to, and not because the remediation paperwork had been suspended or because Holt had given her the word. She moved because 30 to 40 people were 11 minutes out, and the room was not ready, and she was the person in this building who knew best how to make it ready, and those 2 facts together were sufficient. Paul and Terrence were at the doors. Respiratory therapy was paged. The trauma team was responding. She had pulled the first supply cart and was configuring the triage staging when Donna appeared beside her with the secondary kit and fell into the prep without being asked, matching her movements with the efficiency of someone who had watched Nora do this once before and had paid attention. "How many bays can we clear?" Nora said. 5 confirmed. 6 if we move the gentleman in bay 8. He's waiting on discharge paperwork. Move him. Give him a chair in the corridor and get him his paperwork there. She looked at the supply staging. Airway kits at every bay, not just the trauma bays. Structure collapse means dust, debris, inhalation in people who don't look like inhalation injuries. We're going to miss it if we're not set up for it. Donna went. Holt stood at the center of the ER and watched the room configure itself around him. He was not idle. He was on the phone with the trauma surgery attending, pulling in reinforcements, doing the physician-side coordination that needed doing. But his eyes tracked Nora across the room with a regularity she felt without turning to look, the peripheral awareness of someone who had learned to monitor everything in her environment simultaneously. At 7:24, the first ambulance arrived. Then 4 more in the next 90 seconds. What came through the doors was different from the fuel depot response, not in volume, not yet, but in the specific character of the injuries. Structure collapse produced a different injury profile than blast exposure. These patients had crush components, compartment injuries, head trauma from falling debris, and the delayed presentation problem of traumatic asphyxia people who had been pinned, partially compressed, whose bodies were managing the internal pressure of that compression and would begin to decompensate when the compression was released. They could walk in and arrest 40 minutes later. That was the trap that got people killed in structure collapse responses. She said this to the night shift nurses, who, arriving to an ER already in motion, said at once, flat and specific, watch for traumatic asphyxia. Stable on arrival does not mean stable in an hour. Anyone who was pinned or partially buried, regardless of current vitals, gets full monitoring and troponin. She didn't say it as an order. She said it as information. But the night shift nurses wrote it down. The cases came in sequence. A 34-year-old woman with a fractured pelvis, and BP dropping hemorrhagic shock developing, surgery within the hour. A teenage boy, 16, with a traumatic brain injury, GCS of 11, neurology paged. An older man, 68, who had walked in under his own power, smiling, insisting he was fine, whom Nora sat down personally and assessed, and whose breath sounds told her something that made her put him in Bay 3 immediately and Page respiratory, without waiting for the attending to confirm. His name was Dennis Albright, and he had bilateral lower lobe consolidation from dust inhalation, and within 20 minutes, his oxygen saturation had begun a quiet, steady decline that made it clear he would have been in serious trouble in another 30 minutes, in a waiting room chair. "You didn't want to wait," Dennis said while she was setting up the supplemental oxygen. "No. My wife told me to come straight here. I wanted to go home and see if it got better." "Your wife was right. She usually is," he said. "Don't tell her I said that." Despite everything, Nora's mouth did something. That was almost a smile. She got him settled and moved to the next bay. At 8:40, Linda Cho arrived. She came through the main entrance rather than the staff entrance, which meant she had come directly from the event at Pierce Street, and the state of her said exactly what that meant. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder. There was a grayish dust in her hair and on the collar of her blouse. And she was walking with the controlled deliberateness of someone managing pain and refusing to acknowledge it. Donna saw her first and came around the station. "Linda, are you? I'm fine." Her voice was clipped. "I need to report in. I was at the building." Nora looked up from the chart she was closing. She crossed the floor in 12 steps and looked at Linda with the clinical attention she gave every patient, not every administrator. Linda's left arm was held slightly away from her body. Her color was slightly off. She had a laceration above her right eyebrow that had been inadequately addressed with what appeared to be a folded tissue held in place by pressure. "Sit down," Nora said. "I need to speak with. You need to sit down first. Not a request. Not aggressive. Either just the flat, informational certainty of someone who was looking at a person who needed to be sitting and saying so. The conversation can happen while you're sitting." Linda sat. Nora gloved up and examined the laceration, 3 centimeters, ragged edges, not deep enough for the underlying structures to be compromised, but definitely needing closure. She examined Linda's left arm, which Linda had been protecting, without realizing she was doing it. Wrist fracture, non-displaced by palpation, confirmed 20 minutes later by X-ray. Possible mild concussion for something that had grazed the right side of her head, which explained the color. The ceiling came down on one section, Linda said, while Nora was irrigating the laceration. Near the east entrance. About 40 people were in the building. Most got out. Maybe 15 couldn't. How many of those were hospital staff? 7 that I counted, including Dr. Oduya. Nora's hands paused for a fraction of a second, then continued. How bad? She was near the east entrance. Linda stopped. She was one of the people who couldn't get out on her own. I don't know her condition. They took her in a separate ambulance to Mass General. Mass General was the Level I Trauma Center, 40 minutes from Dunmore. If Oduya had been routed there instead of Harwick General, it meant her injuries were beyond what Harwick's surgical capacity could manage. Nora closed the laceration. 12 sutures, precise. She splinted Linda's wrist and documented the concussion's moments, assessment findings, and set her up for observation. Through all of it, Linda sat with the contained expression of a woman processing too many things simultaneously and managing to hold herself together through the specific discipline of someone who had been in institutional management for 18 years and had learned to compartmentalize under pressure, though this was probably testing the limits of that capacity. Marcus Holt, Linda said while Nora was writing the chart notes. What about him? He's been calling the department chair's office since 7:30, before she was confirmed at the scene. Linda's voice was flat and factual, the voice she used when she was being careful. Her assistant told me. He called 3 times. He was trying to reach her about the inquiry. Nora finished the note about the scope expansion. Yes. Linda looked at her hands, the one in the splint, the one that wasn't. Elise Oduya was the person who authorized the scope expansion. She's the one who called the Joint Commission back this afternoon after I spoke to them, this morning. She's the one who put out the communication, suspending your remediation assignment. She paused. She's also currently at Mass General, which means her office is functionally dark until someone with authority acts as interim chair. Nora understood what Linda was not quite saying. With Oduya out of commission, the administrative structure of the department had a gap at the top. The inquiry was ongoing, but its primary institutional point of contact at Harwick General was unavailable. The remediation suspension was posted, but not yet formally processed in the personnel system. It had been announced as a communication. But the paperwork required Oduya's signature to be entered into the official record. And Holt had been calling her office since before anyone knew she was injured. He was trying to reach her before she went down, Nora said. Yes, and now she's unavailable. Yes, who has interim authority while she's out? Linda was quiet for a moment. Under the departmental structure, the senior attending on rotation assumes interim administrative authority for operational decisions. She paused. Tonight's rotation ends at 8, the day rotation. Holt is the senior attending on the day rotation. Yes. Nora set down the pen. She found Holt at the main nursing station at 9:05, reviewing charts from the collapse response. The ER had moved from acute response into the sustained effort of a mass casualty recovery, not the immediate adrenaline of the first hour, but the longer, harder work of managing 27 admitted patients across a department that had been stretched past its comfortable capacity. The night staff were in, the day staff were mostly gone, and Holt was still there, which was either professional dedication or something else. She stood beside him at the station. She didn't perform this, didn't make it confrontational, didn't call attention to it. She simply stood where he could see her and said, quietly, "I know what you're thinking about doing." He looked at her. His face was tired in a way that the earlier controlled version of him hadn't been. The evening had worn through some of the management. "The remediation suspension isn't in the personnel system yet," she said. "Odui is at Mass General. As senior attending, you have interim authority." She held his eyes. "If you try to use that to reverse the suspension or to advance the complaint before the inquiry has a chance to conclude, you document it," he said. "Everything I've done for the last 3 weeks is documented. Every case, every decision, every conversation with Linda, every chart note with a timestamp." She paused. "Including Harold Innes." Something moved across his face at the name. Not guilt. Exactly, she wasn't sure. Holt was built for guilt, in that direct sense, but recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has been made to see the full weight of a decision he made in a context where his certainty had not been warranted. "The Joint Commission has the inquiry," she said. "It has the documentation Delaney's team submitted. It has the complaint pattern from your previous hospitals. Whatever you do in the next 12 hours, it becomes part of what they're looking at." She let that sit. "You're a good physician, Holt. I've watched you work. You make solid calls in most situations." She paused, and this was the part she had to be careful with, the part that could tip one way or the other, depending on how she delivered it. "This situation is not one of them." He was quiet for a long time. "I've been doing this for 15 years, he said. It wasn't a defense. It was something more like a man reading from his own record and finding it complicated. "I know I was not." He stopped. Started again. "I didn't intend for it to go this far." She looked at him. She thought about 3 nurses at 2 other hospitals who had resigned. She thought about the resignation that had presumably been the intended outcome of his campaign against her. She thought about Harold Innes, who was alive in the cardiac unit right now, because she had pushed against a decision that hadn't been right. "The intention doesn't change the record," she said. She left him at the station and went back to her patients. She was in Psych 6 at 9:50 when Donna found her. Donna's face had the expression it got when it was carrying something it didn't know how to put down. She stood in the bay doorway and waited until Nora had finished the assessment she was completing, and then she said, "There's a phone call for you. Linda's office line. The caller says it's the Joint Commission field officer. The patient in Bay 6, a young woman, 28, mild concussion." Observation only looked at Nora with the interested expression of someone who had been lying in a hospital bed for 2 hours and found this development more stimulating than the ceiling. "I'll be back to check on you in 20 minutes, Nora told her, and followed Donna to the office. She picked up the line. "This is Vasquez." "Miss Vasquez, this is Andrew Fell, field investigator, Joint Commission. I apologize for the hour. I understand you've had a difficult evening." "It's all right. What do you need?" "We're requesting a formal statement from you as part of the current review. Your clinical record, the complaint documentation, and the service record submitted by your colleagues have all been entered into the investigation file." He paused. "I also want to inform you that, as of 6:30 this evening, the scope of the inquiry has been expanded to include a 3rd hospital where complaint records matching the pattern we've identified were discovered. 3 hospitals had been OC's number. A 3rd meant a 4th. 4 incidents. 4 targets. When would you need the statement?" she said. "We'd like to meet with you Wednesday, in person, at the hospital." He paused again, and when he continued, his voice had shifted to the careful cadence of someone delivering information they are required to deliver accurately. "Ms. Vasquez, I want to be clear that this inquiry is ongoing and no determinations have been made. But based on the documentation in front of us, the complaint filed against you does not reflect a pattern consistent with legitimate performance management. I want you to have that information. She stood in Linda's office with the phone in her hand and the weight of the last 22 days sitting somewhere just below her sternum, and she breathed in once, slowly, and breathed out. "Thank you," she said. "Wednesday works." She set the phone down. She stood in the office for 30 seconds, alone, looking at Linda's desk, the notepad, the folded hands absent. For once, the hand sanitizer, the small framed photo of Linda with two teenage kids that she had never looked at closely enough before to notice. She looked at it now. The kids were laughing at something out of frame, and Linda was laughing, too, with the unguarded full-face laugh of a person who is not performing anything for anyone. She turned and walked out. Marcus Holt left the hospital at 10:20. She knew because Priya, who was still at the station despite being 2 hours past the end of her shift, tracked it with the attention of someone who had decided sometime during the last 12 hours which side of a line she was standing on. "He's gone," Priya said. Nora nodded. "He didn't access any personnel files before he left. I was watching the system log." Priya said this with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had figured out what she could do and had done it. "I also made sure the Innis chart is locked for addendum. Linda flagged it this afternoon, and I followed up with the system administrator." Nora looked at her. Priya was 26, the youngest person on the unit administrative staff, and she was sitting at her station 2 hours after her shift had ended because she had decided she cared about what happened here. "Go home," Nora said. "You've done enough." "I will," Priya hesitated. "Is it going to be okay? The inquiry and all of it?" Nora thought about that. She thought about Wednesday, about the formal statement, about 4 hospitals, and a pattern that the Joint Commission now had in front of them, with documentation attached. About the classified service record that Delaney's team had submitted, and about Harold Innis in the cardiac unit, and about Linda Cho with her sutured forehead and her splinted wrist saying the parts of this that I could have handled differently. "I think," she said, which was honest. She thought so. She didn't know so, and she wasn't going to perform certainty she didn't have. Priya nodded. She gathered her bag and her jacket and her keys, and she left. Nora stood at the nurse's station alone for a moment, and the ER around her settled into its late-night register, quieter, slower, the specific piece of an institution that has absorbed something large and is processing it. She picked up the next chart. She was 3 minutes into it when she heard the sound from down the hall, the specific acoustic signature of the main entrance doors, late on a Monday night when most of the emergency admissions had settled. She looked up. A man was walking toward the nurse's station with the particular posture of someone who knows exactly where they're going and has a specific purpose for arriving. He was wearing a suit that had been good quality earlier in the day and was now showing the evidence of a difficult evening. He had a credential badge clipped to his lapel, not a Harwick General badge. He stopped at the station. "I'm looking for a nurse named Vasquez," he said. "That's me." He looked at her with the assessing expression of someone doing a fast evaluation and finding it either confirmed or complicated. "My name is Richard Carver. I'm with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, Office of Professional Licensure." He set a business card on the counter. "I was at a function tonight that did not go as planned." She had already seen the dust on his jacket. "The east side of the building, near the entrance." "Are you injured?" she said. "No. I was near enough to the exit to get out cleanly." He paused. "I've been briefed by the Joint Commission field officer this evening on the inquiry and on your situation." He looked at her directly. "I'm here because there's a component of this that falls under DPH jurisdiction, separate from the Joint Commission process, and I needed to see the facility before tomorrow." He paused again. "And because Andrew Fell told me that if I wanted to understand what was actually happening here, I should talk to you directly." Nora looked at Richard Carver. She looked at the business card. She looked at the ER around her, the monitors, the bays, the charts, the night staff moving through their cases. "All right," she said. "What do you need to know?" "Everything," he said, "starting from the beginning." She pulled a chair out from behind the station and set set it on the other side of the counter, and she sat down across from him, and she began. She was 20 minutes into it, the Bay 4 incident, the documentation notes, the formal complaint, the remediation assignment, when her phone buzzed on the counter beside her. She glanced at it. A text from a Harwick General internal number she recognized as belonging to the surgical floor charge nurse. The text read, "Thought you should know. Patient from tonight, Dennis Albright. Bay 3, your catch. Cardiology just confirmed bilateral pulmonary emboli. If he'd gone home, he wouldn't have made it to morning. He's asking who the nurse was that made him stay." She set the phone back down. Carver was watching her. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she said. "Where were we?" "The formal complaint. The addendum." "Right." She folded her hands on the counter. "On November 7th, I responded to a mass casualty event at this facility. 31 patients. The department was configured before the first ambulance arrived, and 4 people who would not have survived a standard response are alive because of decisions I made in that window." She paused. "The day after, the physician who had been filing complaints against me submitted an addendum to his existing complaint, characterizing my actions during that response as dangerous overreach." She held Carver's eyes. "He used the word reckless. I want you to have that word in context." Carver was writing. The ER moved around them, quiet and functional, and carrying its usual weight of human emergency, and Nora sat at the counter in her navy scrubs with her badge at her collar and her hands folded, and she told the truth, which was what she had always done, and let it go where it needed to go. She was halfway through the account of the remediation process when Carver paused his writing and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been listening carefully and has arrived at a conclusion. "I need to ask you something directly," he said. "Go ahead." "The complaint history, the pattern across facilities." He set down his pen. "When did you know that it had happened before?" "Yes, today," she said. "This morning. One of the people from my former unit identified it during their research." Carver picked up his pen again. "This morning," he repeated, writing. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, Ms. Vasquez, I want to be transparent with you. The scope of what we're looking at has expanded significantly in the last 4 hours. There are 4 facilities now, 4 separate complaint sequences, all from the same physician, all targeting nursing staff, all resulting in either resignation or reassignment before the complaints could be formally reviewed." He paused. "Yours is the first that didn't." She absorbed that. 3 nurses who had left, 1 who hadn't. "We're going to need formal statements from the staff here," Carver continued. "From the physicians who worked alongside you. From Linda Cho. From the administrative record." He paused. "And we're going to need access to something that Dr. Holt's personnel file may or may not contain, depending on what his prior institutions included at the time of his credentialing." "What specifically?" Carver looked at her with the careful expression of someone who is about to say something that has not yet left the internal process. "There was a civil settlement," he said. 2019. Sealed terms. One of the nurses at the second facility, the one who filed a wrongful dismissal claim." He paused. "We've been in contact with her attorney today. The terms of the settlement included a non-disclosure clause." Another pause. "She wants to speak." Nora was very still. "She's been waiting," Carver said, "for someone else to not leave." The ER around her continued its quiet functioning monitors, the low voices of the night staff, the soft percussion of the institutional rhythm that never fully stopped. Outside the windows, Dunmore was dark and cold, the fog back in off the bay, the streetlights making halos in the wet air. Nora looked at Richard Carver. She thought about a woman she had never met, at a hospital she had never worked in, who had filed a complaint and settled and signed a non-disclosure and had been waiting for, how long? A year? 2? For someone to make it possible for her to speak. She thought about 3 nurses, about resignation, about the process that made resignation feel like the only option. She thought about what Carver had just told her and what it meant, and she understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has been trained to read the implications of a situation across its full scope, that what was happening was larger than her complaint and her remediation and her 3 weeks of being systematically undermined in this building. "When does she want to speak?" Nora said. Carver looked at her with something that might have been, under the professional surface, relief. "She's available Wednesday, the same day as your Joint Commission statement." He paused. "She asked specifically whether you would be present." Nora looked at her hands on the counter. She looked at the night shift nurses moving through their cases. She looked at the board on the wall, where Oduya's communication was still posted, the one suspending the remediation, the one that Holt had been trying to reach Oduya about before the building came down, and everything changed. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there." Carver nodded. He closed his notepad. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing expression that had been on his face since he'd walked in, and now it had resolved into something more settled. "One more thing," he said, "and this is not official. This is me speaking directly." He paused. Dr. Holtz submitted a formal communication to the interim administrative office at 8:58 tonight, 40 minutes after he left this building. He watched her. He requested that the remediation suspension be reversed, citing Dr. Oduya's unavailability and his own interim authority as senior attending. Nora looked at him. The request was logged at 9:02, Carver said, and forwarded by the administrative assistant, who apparently decided this was not a decision that should be made without oversight directly to the Joint Commission field officer. He paused. It arrived in Andrew Fell's inbox at 9:07. The silence between them lasted for 3 seconds. He didn't know the administrative assistant had that contact, Nora said. "No," Carver said. He did not. She walked Carver out at 11:40 and stood at the main entrance for a moment after the doors closed behind him, watching his car pull out of the parking lot into the fog. The sleet had stopped. The air was just cold now, clean and still, the kind of cold that clarifies things. She went back to her patients. Dennis Albright was awake when she looked in on him at midnight. He was propped up on 2 pillows with the oxygen mask adjusted to the side of his face in the way patients always adjusted oxygen masks the moment they felt well enough to find them annoying, and he was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had been given a very specific piece of information about his evening and was still processing it. He looked at her when she came in. "Bilateral pulmonary emboli," he said. "Yes." The doctor upstairs explained it. He was quiet for a moment. "She said if I'd gone home, you didn't go home." "My wife told me not to." He looked at her. "The nurse at the front, she told me it was you. That made me stay." Nora adjusted the oxygen mask back into the correct position. He let her. "Your wife and your lungs both made good decisions tonight. Get some sleep. My wife is going to be insufferable about this for the rest of our lives." "Probably," Nora said, and left him to it. She finished her shift at 12:30, 45 minutes past the end of her scheduled hours, which was not unusual and which she did not count. She drove home along the Bay Road in the dark and the cold, and she did not think about Wednesday. She thought about Dennis Albright's wife being insufferable, and about Benji with his 9 stitches and his future scar, and about Harold Innes in the cardiac unit who had described kidney stone pain as parkour performed by a pebble, and she thought about the specific texture of the work, the ordinary, human, imperfect, necessary texture of it, and she drove with the window cracked the way she always did when she needed the air moving against her face. She was home by 1. She ate a piece of toast standing at the counter and went to bed, and this time she did not lie awake. Wednesday arrived the way important days, often, do, looking exactly like an ordinary one. She arrived at 6:45. She did her walk. She checked the crash cart and the supply closets and said good morning to the overnight staff. She noted 2 things that needed attention and addressed them before her shift formally began. She was in the middle of her first medication check when Donna appeared beside her with 2 coffees, one for herself and one extended toward Nora without comment, which was its own kind of statement. Nora took it. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Donna said. "I'm covering your 2 o'clock cases, so you can make your meeting." The Joint Commission interview was scheduled for 2. The conversation with the woman from the second hospital, her name, Nora had learned through Carver, was Pauline Reyes, and she had been a charge nurse with 14 years of experience. Before she resigned, was scheduled for 3:30. She worked the morning with the same attention she gave every morning, which was all of it. At 11, Linda Cho came to the floor. Her wrist was in a proper cast now, not the splint from Monday night, and the laceration above her eyebrow had been properly dressed and showed the beginning of the bruise pattern that would take 2 weeks to fade. She moved carefully, professionally. But she moved, and the expression on her face had the settled quality of someone who had made a decision and was acting on it. She stopped at the nurse's station. She looked at Nora directly. "Dr. Oduya is stable," she said. "She's at Mass General. Fractured femur, internal bleeding. That was addressed in surgery last night. She's going to be out of commission for several weeks." She paused. "She called me this morning from the ICU. She wanted to know about the inquiry status. She wanted to know about you. What did you tell her?" The truth, Linda's voice, was even. All of it, including the parts that reflect poorly on how this department managed the last 3 weeks. She held Nora's gaze. "She asked me to convey to you that the remediation suspension is confirmed in the official record as of this morning. I processed the paperwork myself, and she authorized it verbally, which is sufficient under the charter when the chair is medically incapacitated." She paused. "Your personnel record has been corrected. The complaint notation has been flagged as pending inquiry, which, under DH guidelines, suspends its evaluative weight." Nora absorbed this. "Thank you, Linda. I also want to say something that isn't administrative." Linda stood with her cast at her side and her bruised face and the expression of a woman doing something that cost her something. "I watched what happened in this department for 3 weeks, and I managed my response to it in a way that I told myself was procedurally correct. It was procedurally correct." She paused. "It was also not enough. And I knew it wasn't enough, and I chose procedure over the thing I actually knew to be true." She stopped. "I'm sorry for that. Specifically, not generally." Nora looked at her. She thought about the woman who had folded her hands on a desk and performed neutrality while a man with institutional power built a case. She thought about the woman who had told a federal investigator yes when asked if Nora was currently employed and in good standing. She thought about the woman who had been at the Pierce Street building with the foundation's donor reception and had walked out with a torn jacket and a broken wrist and come straight to the hospital to report in. People were complicated. She had always known that. The Linda who had been insufficient in October and the Linda who was standing here now were the same person, and people's capacity to be insufficient, and then, better than that, was one of the things she had learned over a long time, and in difficult places, to hold without contempt. "I know," she said. "I appreciate you saying it." Linda nodded once and walked away, and that was the end of that. And it was enough. The Joint Commission interview lasted 90 minutes. Andrew Fell was methodical and thorough, and he asked questions with the precise phrasing of someone who understood that the way a question is worded shapes the answer it receives. Nora answered everything directly. She had her documentation with her, every time-stamped note, every chart entry, the personnel file excerpts she had been provided by Carver, and she presented it without drama, without editorializing, without the emotional performance that people sometimes layer over factual accounts when they want the facts to hit harder. The facts hit hard enough on their own. When Fell asked about the Harold Innes case, specifically the delayed cardiology consult, the chart note, the eventual cath lab findings, she laid it out in the same order she had lived it. The presentation, the assessment, the note, the decision, the call from cardiology, the transfer, the L-add occlusion that had been developing quietly behind what looked like a stable EKG. Fell wrote for a long time after she finished that section. One question, he said. The chart note you entered at 12:20. The one documenting your clinical concern and the supervising physician's decision. He looked at her. You entered that note knowing it would create a record of a clinical disagreement between yourself and the physician who was managing your remediation. Yes. You knew that could be used against you. I knew that a patient with an unaddressed LAD occlusion was going to be used against himself if someone didn't document the situation clearly. She paused. The note was about him, not about me. Fell looked at what he'd written. He looked at her. Thank you, Ms. Vasquez, he said. We'll be in contact within 10 business days with preliminary findings. Pauline Reyes was 51, with the specific kind of face that carries 14 years of charge nursing. In every line, competent, watchful, capable of warmth, and capable of the opposite when the situation required it. She had driven up from Providence that morning. She sat across the table in the conference room. The conference room that Carver had arranged, and she looked at Nora with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this meeting many times in her imagination and was now adjusting to the reality of it. You didn't leave, Pauline said. No, I did. She said it without apology and without excessive weight. Just the fact. 17 months at Northeastern General. He started the complaint process in month 11. By month 16, I had 3 formal notations in my file, and I was under remediation and I was exhausted. She paused. I filed the wrongful dismissal claim after I left. I should have filed it before, but I didn't have the energy to fight and work at the same time, and I chose to fight after. She looked at her hands on the table. The settlement was $60,000 and a non-disclosure clause. My attorney told me $60,000 was good. I signed it. She looked up. I've spent 4 years thinking about whether I should have. Nora looked at her. You did what you could with what you had. So did you. Pauline held her eyes. You had something I didn't. What? You had people who came back for you. She said it, without bitterness, just observation, clear-eyed. The team, the inquiry, the documentation that got this whole thing moving. She paused. I didn't have that. I had a lawyer and a depleted bank account and the knowledge that I'd been right about everything. And it hadn't mattered. Nora was quiet for a moment. It mattered today. Pauline looked at her. You signing that NDA, Nora said, was a decision you made under specific conditions that I didn't have to face. The fact that you're here now, with an attorney who found a way to bring you forward despite the clause that's not small. She held Pauline's gaze. The inquiry has 4 facilities, 4 documented complaint sequences. The case that exists right now exists partly because you filed that wrongful dismissal claim. It exists in the record. It was findable. She paused. Your 14 years were not erased when you signed that paper. Pauline was quiet for a long time. Something moved across her face, not relief exactly, but the specific release of a pressure that had been sustained long enough to become invisible. I want to give a formal statement, Pauline said. That's why I'm here. I know. I want it on record that what happened to me happened to others. That it was a pattern and not an accident and not a performance issue. Her voice was steady. I want it to matter that I say so. It will, Nora said. It already does. The findings came in 9 business days, which was 1 day faster than Fell had estimated. They came as a formal communication to Harwick General's administrative office, addressed to the interim department chair, a position that, in Dr. Oduya's absence, had been assigned to a physician named Dr. Carol Raines, who had been brought in from the internal medicine division and who had the advantage of having no investment in the previous month's politics. Nora heard about the findings from Linda, who called her at home on a Thursday evening with the particular directness that Linda had been using since Monday night, the version of herself that had decided to stop managing and start saying things plainly. The Joint Commission findings cited a sustained pattern of complaint filings by Dr. Marcus Holt against nursing staff at 4 separate institutions over a period of 11 years. They cited the Harold Innes case as evidence of supervisory judgment that had prioritized administrative authority over patient safety. They cited the remediation assignment, that's the placement of a nurse under the supervisory authority of the physician who had filed the complaint against her as a structural failure in the facility's administrative oversight. The recommended actions: suspension of Holt's clinical privileges, pending a full credentialing review. Mandatory review of all complaint filings against nursing staff at Harwick General for the preceding 5 years. A structural audit of the remediation assignment protocol. And stated in the flat institutional language that regulatory bodies use for things that are not optional, the formal expungement of the complaint record from Nora Vasquez's personnel file, with a notation that the complaint had been found to lack clinical or professional merit. He's suspended, Linda said. Effective today. The credentialing review will take months. His attorney is involved. Nora stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and looked out the window at the bay, which was dark and still in the early evening, the fog sitting low over the water, the way it always did. The DPH is following up separately on the Northeastern General Settlement, Linda continued. Pauline Reyes's statement has been entered into the DPH's physician conduct record. That's permanent. A pause. The other 2 nurses, from the other 2 facilities, the investigators tracked them down this week. Both are giving statements. 4 complaint sequences. 4 women. A pattern that had been running for 11 years in the gaps between institutional credentialing processes, exploiting the places where hospitals didn't look carefully enough at what they were hiring and didn't ask the questions that would have surfaced what he was doing. 11 years was a long time. Long enough that it could feel, from the outside, like the kind of thing that was simply how things worked. Like an inevitability. Like the natural order of a hierarchy that had always functioned this way and would always function this way and was not something that one person's refusal to leave could change. It turned out it was something that one person's refusal to leave could change. Not fix entirely the 4 of them would carry what had happened, regardless of what the record said now, but change in the specific, limited, concrete way that accountability changes things, by making the next time less likely, by putting a cost on the pattern that the pattern had not previously carried. She stood at the window and thought about that for a moment. Nora, Linda said, there's one more thing. Go ahead. Dr. Oduya called again today from Mass General. She's going to be on medical leave for 6 weeks minimum. A pause. She's asked me to convey a formal offer. It's not my place to advocate for it. That's between you and the administration. But she asked me to make sure you heard it directly. Linda paused again. She wants to create a new position. Clinical Safety Coordinator for the Emergency Department. The role would give the occupant formal authority to flag patient safety concerns at the attending level with independent documentation and direct access to the department chair. Another pause. She said you want someone who has already demonstrated they'll use it even when it costs them something. The bay outside was dark and the fog was moving, the way it always moved slowly, without apparent direction, reshaping itself around whatever it encountered. I'll think about it, Nora said. That's all she asked, Linda said. Get some rest. She didn't sleep right away. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold before she drank half of it, and she thought about the last 22 days in the way she thought about Operation after they concluded not to congratulate herself, not to process the emotional weight of them, but to understand what had actually happened and why. What had happened? A man who was good at one thing had decided she was a problem, had used the tools available to him to try to make her small enough to remove, and had underestimated her in the specific way that people underestimated her, which was by looking at what she was and not at what she had been and what that had made her. She had been underestimated her whole career in the military, which had required her to prove herself At a standard, it didn't apply to the men beside her. And in civilian medicine, where the same dynamic operated through different language, but the same essential logic. She had never stopped being underestimated. She had just stopped being undone by it. What had also happened, Pauline Reyes had driven up from Providence. Seven people had crossed a parking lot in the sleet. A unit secretary had stayed 2 hours past her shift to watch a system log. Linda Cho had processed paperwork from a hospital bed with a broken wrist. An administrative assistant, whose name Nora still didn't know, had forwarded a document to the right person at the right moment, for reasons that were probably simple and human, because it had seemed wrong, because she had been paying attention, because sometimes people in institutions make the right decision not because of protocols, but because they are people. That was the thing that institutional conflict obscured, if you weren't careful, the way it reduced everything to adversaries and processes and documentation, the way it made humans disappear behind their roles. Holt was an adversary, and also a physician who had been good at something for 15 years and had built a self on top of that something that couldn't tolerate being questioned. Linda was a cautious institutional actor, and also a woman who had been in a collapsing building and had come straight to work afterward. Donna was a gossip, and also someone who had stayed in her lane for 3 weeks and had then, quietly and without announcement, decided not to. People were what they were in the moments when the situation demanded they be something. She had learned this in places where the stakes were different and the cost of miscalculation was more immediate, and the lesson applied here with the same force. You could not know, looking at a person in their ordinary presentation, what they would do when the moment arrived. You could only watch and learn as it happened, and adjust your understanding accordingly. She had adjusted a lot of understandings in the last 3 weeks. She picked up her phone, she looked at it for a moment, then texted Delaney. Findings came in. It's done. Thank you for coming. His response arrived 4 minutes later, which meant he was still awake, which did not surprise her. Good. You were always going to be the one who stayed. A pause between messages, and then, how's the work? She thought about Dennis Albright and his wife being insufferable. She thought about Benji and his scar. She thought about Harold Innes doing parkour on his own metaphors. She thought about the 73-year-old woman with the broken hip she had assessed on Tuesday morning, who had been terrified and in pain, and who had held Nora's hand during the IV placement with the tight grip of someone trying not to show how scared they were, and to whom Nora had said quietly, "I've got you," and had meant it in the simple, direct, immediate way that you could mean things in this work, which was different from other kinds of meaning, but was not less. She typed back, "The work is good." She set the phone down and finished what was left of the cold tea and went to bed. She was back at 6:45 on Friday morning. The fog was in. The parking lot smelled like salt and cold pavement. The building was the same building it had always been: imperfect brick, mismatched additions, the covered walkway that leaked in heavy rain. Inside, the overnight staff was packing up, and the day shift was arriving in the particular overlap of exhaustion and fresh energy that defined every morning handoff in every emergency department everywhere. She did her walk. Crash cart, supply closets, bottleneck points, monitor settings. She noted one thing that needed attention and addressed it. She said good morning to the overnight nurse, a tall, quiet man named Phil, who always looked mildly surprised to see her, even though she was there every morning, and she asked how the night had gone and listened to the answer. She was in the middle of the first medication check when Priya appeared beside her. "How are you?" Priya said. Not the passing professional courtesy of the hospital corridor. The actual question. Nora thought about it, which she didn't always do when people asked. "Good," she said. "I think I'm actually good." Priya nodded, satisfied, and went back to her station. An hour into the shift, Donna appeared with a chart and a secondary question that she could have looked up herself and hadn't. which Nora recognized as the particular kind of professional engagement that means someone has decided you are worth talking to, that you are worth the small friction of asking instead of just looking it up. She answered the question. They talked about the case for 3 minutes. It was ordinary and it was not nothing. At 9:30, she received a formal written communication from the office of the interim department chair confirming the expungement of the complaint notation from her personnel record. The communication was 2 paragraphs, institutional language, HR copy. She read it once, confirmed what it said, and filed it in her documentation folder alongside everything else. She did not celebrate. She did not share it at the nurse's station. She filed it and went back to her patients because the patients did not stop and the work did not stop. And this was, she had decided over a cup of cold tea the night before, exactly how she wanted it. The vindication arriving as a document in a folder, the work continuing as the work, the morning looking like every other morning, except that the thing that had been pressing on her for 22 days was no longer pressing. She had, in her life, been in situations where the mission concluded with ceremony, the debrief, the commendation, the formal recognition of what had been accomplished. She had always found those moments more uncomfortable than meaningful. What she found meaningful was what came after, when the structure went back to normal and the ordinary demands resumed. And there was simply the work and the quality of attention you brought to it. She brought all of her attention to it. She always had. At 2 in the afternoon, she was in the corridor outside Bay 4 when she heard her name. She turned. It was a patient being discharged, a middle-aged woman she had treated. On Monday night, during the collapse response, a minor head laceration, nothing dramatic. The woman was in her street clothes, discharge papers in hand. Her husband stands beside her with their coats. "You were the nurse Monday night," the woman said. "Yes. I don't remember much. They told me afterward." She paused, looking at Nora with the slightly uncertain expression of someone who wants to say something and is not sure they have the right words for it. "Thank you. For whatever you did." She paused. "For being there." Nora looked at her. She thought about all the things that had happened in the weeks preceding this moment, the complaint, the remediation, the 7 people in the parking lot, the inquiry, the findings, the formal letter in the folder in her bag. All of it, the full weight of it. "That's what I'm here for," she said, and she meant it exactly as simply as it sounded. The woman nodded and walked toward the exit with her husband, and Nora watched them go, and then she turned back to the corridor and the work that was waiting, and she went to it. The strongest people in any room are almost never the ones performing strength. They are the ones who stayed when leaving was easier. Who documented when silence would have been safer? Who said, "I've got you to a frightened patient"? Who got you to a frightened patient and meant it in the middle of everything else happening around them? Who understood that their value was not located in the opinions of the people who underestimated them, and who kept working from that understanding even when no one was watching, even when the reward for the work was more work, even when the system that was supposed to protect them didn't. Nora Vasquez walked back to her patients. She was 38 years old, and she had survived things she would never fully describe, and she was standing in an imperfect building in a cold city, doing work that was hard and necessary and hers. That was enough. That had always been enough. She picked up the next chart, and she began.